Greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome to the second annual Black History Month Conference, co-hosted by the National Black Occupational Therapy Caucus, known as NBOTC, and Black male registered occupational therapy professionals, assistants, and students, known as BROTHAS. My name is Dr. DeWanna Russell Thomas, and I am honored to serve as the president of NBOTC, a nonprofit organization whose purpose is to act as an advocate for Black occupational therapy practitioners and occupational therapy students in order to enhance and promote their contributions to the occupational therapy profession, national and state associations, and public at large. One way that we more fully live into our purpose is through this event, where the voices, the scholarship, the wisdom, the intersectionality, and the lived experiences of Black occupational therapists and students are moved from the margins to the center. Today, we lift up a timely topic: mental health. History, extreme world events, in addition to COVID, have done something to us as occupational beings. We see it everywhere. And we hope to unpack a bit of what's happening with mental health and leave you empowered to take next steps towards creating a healthier you, profession, and community. Mr. Howard?
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Russell. Thank you, Dr. Yancey. And thank you, Ms. Jerry Bentley. Good morning again to everyone. My name is Donald Howard. I serve as president for BROTHAS, an organization consisting of occupational therapists, occupational therapy assistants, and students endeavoring to coordinate, cultivate, and strengthen the male experience in occupational therapy. We are indeed excited, especially for today, with the culmination of things that will shortly come your way with our timely topic, as Dr. Russell mentioned, mental health, unmasking the mass dilemma. We want to acknowledge and show appreciation of our sponsors on today, the Greater Charlotte Healthcare Executive Group, known as GCHEG, and also Dr. Douglas Jackson. We want to thank them for their acknowledgement and for their coordination with us as well. Without further ado, I will give way. And again, thank you all for individually sacrificing your time, your talents, and we pray that it would be a meaningful and uplifting event for all on today. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you so much. And again, I want to remind everyone who has just come on, if you can go ahead and update your display name, indicating if you're a student, place an S in parentheses by your name or a P as professional or provider. So that way we can appropriately place you in our breakout sessions later in the conference. So without further ado, we're going to go into our keynote speaker, Dr. Sabrina Salvant. She is currently the Vice President of Education and Professional Development for AOTA. Dr. Salvant is actively involved in the American Occupational Therapy Association for over 25 years, first as an accreditation volunteer and now as part of the senior leadership team engaging in strategic planning and visioning. Her tenure as an employee with the association started as the director of accreditation, where she was responsible for the oversight, strategic direction, and representation of the accreditation department. In conjunction with the accreditation staff, Accreditation Council for Occupational Therapy Education, and volunteer accreditation evaluators. She addressed complex issues related to higher education and accreditation and liaised between AOTA, ACOTE, United States Department of Education, Council for Higher Education Accreditation, and all internal and external stakeholders. Currently, she serves as the Vice President of Education and Professional Development, where she provides oversight for entry-level education through professional development post-graduation. She engages in strategic visioning and planning as it relates to associations' overarching vision for the occupational therapy profession. It is, and its response for association-wide continuous professional development, as well as entry-level education and accreditation. So I'm asking everybody if you can go ahead, reach into your reaction tab and put a round of applause and welcoming Dr. Sabrina Salvant. Please welcome her. Please put in the celebratory horns. Welcome her, welcome her. I also ask that if you have any questions, please go ahead and place that into the chat. We'll go ahead and be monitoring that and we'll address the questions in the end. Okay, Dr. Salvant, the floor is yours.
So thank you for allowing me to participate in this event. It's an honor and a privilege. So there are a variety of factors that interfere with African Americans seeking and receiving mental health services. Black people have greater vulnerability to being uninsured or underinsured, have access barriers related to how the health system is structured. For example, the hours of operation, ease of scheduling. Do they have the social and family support needed to manage their mental health condition? There are communication barriers that go beyond language related to understanding what is required to manage their mental health condition. It must also be considered. African Americans have a long history of abuse from the medical and research community, which has fostered fear and mistrust of treatment. Some of the better known cases include the forced sterilization of BIPOC women or the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. I knew a lot of this information prior to developing this presentation, but wanted to explore some of the historical factors that are deeply rooted in all African American psyche. That results from the historical and generational trauma that we all carry with us on a daily basis and is at the root of all of our attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors related to mental and behavioral health, our help-seeking behaviors, as well as our medication and treatment compliance. I wanted to start with our history as a way to contextualize everything that we will discuss today. So let's start with a focus on the historical context of systemic racism in mental health and how racial differences shaped treatment encounters. In the United States, scientific racism was used to justify slavery to appease the opposition to the Atlantic slave trade. Black men were described as having primitive psychological organization, making them uniquely fitted for bondage. Benjamin Rush, who was the father of American psychiatry, described Negroes as suffering from an affliction called negritude. What is negritude, you ask? It's a mild form of leprosy in which the only cure is to become white. In 1851, Samuel Cartwright, a prominent American physician who practiced in Mississippi during the antebellum, stated that slavery is a natural state because slaves benefited from the hard work and were incapable of looking after themselves outside of slavery. He used the Bible to support this position, stating that slaves needed to be kept in a submissive state and treated like children to both prevent and cure them from running away. This led to the idea that enslaved people demonstrated childlike simplicity and lacked complex emotional processes, that they were somehow less than human and didn't feel the same way white people did, and therefore not suitable for things like psychoanalysis or group therapy. Leading health professionals propagated the idea that Blacks were less than to justify exploitation and experimentation. This led to a dual system in many hospitals where Black patients were kept in separate substandard facilities and put to work in the hospital laundry, kitchen, and fields. In 1851, Cartwright also published a report where he invented two psychiatric disorders, drapetomania and dysesthesia aethiopica. Drapetomania is the tendency of enslaved people to run away. This diagnosis continued to exist in the Practical Medical Dictionary. Now that's the reference guide that physicians currently use, but this existed well into the 20th century. He stated that the disorder was a consequence of slave masters who made themselves too familiar with the slaves, treating them as equals. He believed this was treatable, and the treatment included whipping the devil out of them as a preventative measure, as well as the removal of the big toes to make running a physical impossibility. Diaesthesia aethiopica was the enslaved people's tendency to resist hard work. He believed that this caused laziness and disrespect for the master's property, that being slaves, and was characterized by insensitivity of the skin and mental dullness of intellectual faculties. He described this like a person half asleep. He believed it was more prevalent amongst free Negroes and that those who were free suffered mental illness at a higher rate than those who were enslaved. Of course, whipping was a treatment of choice for this disorder. After slavery was abolished with the enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation, Southern states embraced the criminal justice system as an alternative way of racial control. They developed Black codes, which were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedoms of African Americans and ensure access to cheap labor. How this worked is that they required individuals to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. If they left prematurely and broke the contract, they would have to repay earned wages or risk being imprisoned if they couldn't repay. This caused an unprecedented number of Black men, women, and children to be returned to slavery-like conditions through forced labor and convict leasing that lasted well into the 20th century. So imagine the psychological impact of being told you're free, but having to constantly deal with a system that is not controlled by you, but continues to oppress you even though you're free. Sound familiar? Prior to the civil rights movement, schizophrenia was described as a largely white, docile, and generally harmless condition. Mainstream magazines from the 1920s to the 1950s connected schizophrenia to neurosis and attached the term to middle-class housewives. That changed in the 1960s, where the American public and the scientific community began to increasingly describe schizophrenia as a violent social disease. A growing number of research articles asserted that the disorder was manifested by rage, volatility, and aggression, and was a condition that afflicted Negro men. In 1968, an article in the Archives of General Psychiatry described schizophrenia as a protest psychosis, where Black men develop hostile and aggressive feelings and delusional anti-whiteness beliefs after listening to or aligning with activist groups such as the Black Panthers or the Nation of Islam. Mainstream white America describes schizophrenia as a condition of angry Black masculinity, warning of crazed Black schizophrenic killers on the loose. The cause of urban violence was now due to brain dysfunction, not systemic oppression, socioeconomic status, poverty, racism, or discrimination. A category of paranoid schizophrenia for Black males was created while casting women, neurotics, and other non-threatening individuals into the expanded categories of mood disorders. Leading neuroscientists recommended psychosurgery, also known as frontal lobotomy, as the treatment of choice to prevent outbreaks of violence, and psychiatric treatment was required because the symptoms threatened Black men's own sanity, as well as the social order of white America. Advertisements for new pharmacological treatments for schizophrenia in the 1960s and 70s reflected similar themes. In the 1970s, psychiatrists added the word aggressive to the definition of schizophrenia and marketed pharmaceuticals directly to Black patients who they felt were more out of control. This is an example of an ad for the antipsychotic Haldol that ran during that time. It depicts an angry Black man with clenched fists in an urban scene with the headline, "Assaultive and Belligerent." And the article states that Haldol acts promptly to control aggressive and assaultive behavior. The Black psyche was increasingly portrayed as unwell, immoral, aggressive, violent, and inherently criminal. This helped justify the need for police brutality in the civil rights movement, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarcerations in prisons and psychiatric hospitals. Attempts to rehabilitate took a back seat to structural attempts to control. State hospitals that were usually governed by white male superintendents employed unlicensed doctors to administer massive amounts of electric shock and chemical therapies that allowed them to then put patients to work in the fields. The deplorable conditions in these institutions went unchanged and unchallenged as late as 1969 in some states. With the development in pharmaceuticals, psychiatrists were optimistic that severe psychotic and mood states that were previously viewed as untreatable could be treated in the community setting. The government thought this was an opportunity to address the inequity in mental health treatment and treatment facilities. In 1963, they enacted the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act to change the way people with mental illnesses were confined. They recognized that hospitals were like holding facilities rather than places of restorative or rehabilitative care, and provided money to states to build new community-based services. They did this in lieu of state mental health hospitals where those with serious mental illness were being treated. CMHA funded 3 years of federal grant payments to the states, totaling $150 million for the physical construction and initial staffing of 1,500 community mental health centers to provide 5 essential services: consultation and education for the community and professional organizations, inpatient facilities, outpatient clinics, emergency response, and partial hospitalization. This initiative failed due to a lack of program standardization. Since each state was free to develop their own programs, CMHA was left with the development of a variety of community mental health centers, producing a variety of treatment approaches, so it's difficult for them to effectively assess program outcomes and effectiveness, as well as to regulate. Treatment became focused on those with less serious mental illness who were not previously in state hospitals at the expense of individuals who required assistance to function in daily life. They also did not provide the expensive basic provisions like housing, health insurance, psychiatric support, social work or social services that individuals with serious mental illness needed to live independently in the community. Those who did not have access in the community mental health centers relied on family and friends. So those without social support networks ended up homeless on the streets or in the jails and prisons. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, included a clause that declared it illegal for any facility or service receiving federal funds to discriminate on the grounds of race. The goal was to end racial segregation in all of the country's hospitals, including its psychiatric ones. States like Alabama and Mississippi were actively pursuing policies of racial segregation, claiming that it was their right to run the state service free of federal interference, and that it was medically necessary to segregate patients along racial lines. They were in constant danger of losing existing funding due to their resistance to comply. In 1967, the Office of Equal Health Opportunity within the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare inspected facilities in the South and found that psychiatric hospitals, particularly in those 2 states, continued to operate in breach of the Civil Rights Act. They found that the facilities were deplorable and ill-kept, and that there weren't enough psychiatrists to manage the number of patients in the facilities. They also found that many of the psychiatrists were foreign trained and not licensed in the United States, and many could not handle the severity of the cases. So we've talked about a few of the historical traumas that impacted African Americans. I want you to keep those top of mind as we talk about demographics, as well as the structural and cultural impacts. When compared with people who are white, Black people and Black Indigenous people of color are less likely to have access to mental health services, less likely to seek out mental health services, less likely to receive needed mental health care, more likely to receive poor quality of care, more likely to end services prematurely, more likely to experience chronic and persistent rather than episodic mental health conditions. Adult African Americans are more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than white adults. African Americans are less likely than white people to die from suicide at all ages. However, African American teenagers are more likely to attempt suicide than white teenagers. African American people living below poverty are twice as likely to report serious psychological distress than those living over 2 times the poverty level. They are more likely to identify and describe physical symptoms like body aches and pains when talking about depression. A healthcare provider who is not culturally competent might not recognize these as symptoms of a mental health condition. They may also attempt to self-medicate by resorting to binge drinking, smoking, illicit drug use, and prescription pain medication misuse. Additionally, Black individuals are more likely to receive a misdiagnosis of schizophrenia when expressing symptoms related to mood disorders, particularly when referring to Black men. Black men are overdiagnosed with schizophrenia. They are 4 times more likely than white men to receive this diagnosis and are underdiagnosed with PTSD and mood disorders. Remember when I talked about this in the history section, it's still pervasive today. The cultural competence of the healthcare practitioner is essential in treating this population. Understanding the subtle nuances that are embedded within African Americans' cultural norms helps the healthcare practitioner to engage in better diagnosis management and treatment planning. Especially important because the majority of mental health providers in the United States are white. Less than 2% of the American Psychological Association members are African American. The concern is that mental health care practitioners are not culturally competent enough to treat the specific issues that African Americans face. It's no secret that African American people are overrepresented in our jails and prisons. They make up about 13% of the general US population, but nearly 40% of the prison population. In 2016, the imprisonment rate for African American men was 2,417 per 100,000 Black male residents. This was more than 6 times greater than that for white men, which came in at 401 per 100,000. It's no better for African American women. Their imprisonment rate was 97 per 100,000 Black female residents versus 49 per 100,000 white female residents. That's almost double the amount. African American people with mental health conditions, specifically those involving psychosis, are more likely to be in jail or prison than people of other races. Unfortunately, for many, the first time they receive mental health care is in the criminal justice system. Statistics tell us that over 50% of those incarcerated have mental health concerns. Rather than receiving treatment for mental illness, African Americans end up incarcerated because of their symptoms. In jails and prisons, the standard of care for mental health treatment is generally low, and prison practices themselves are often traumatic and punitive. Structural impacts that affect mental health conditions include all the socioeconomic factors like education, healthcare, health insurance, the neighborhood you live in and its access to resources, the social and community support and resources, the economic stability of the individual and the neighborhood they live in. Socioeconomic factors can make treatment options less available. Those who experience socioeconomic disparity are more likely to experience exclusion from health, educational, social, and economic resources, which contributes to worse mental health outcomes. More than 1 in 5 African American people in the US live in poverty as of 2018. In 2020, 10.4% of Black adults in the US had no form of health insurance. Despite the fact that the Affordable Care Act helped to close the gap in the uninsured individuals, 11.5% of African Americans versus 7.5% of white Americans were still uninsured in 2018. Black and African American people living below poverty are twice as likely to report serious psychological distress than those living over 2 times the poverty level. In 2016, 12.3% of African American adults who had a doctor's visit or a clinic visit over the past year had difficulty getting needed care test, or treatment compared to 6.8% of white adults. Many were unable to find an African-American mental health specialist. In 2018, 58.2% of African-American young adults, 18 to 25, and 50.1% of adults, 26 to 49, with serious mental illness did not receive treatment. 90% of African-American people over 12 years with substance use disorder did not receive treatment. Black adults in the US are more likely than white adults to report persistent symptoms of emotional distress, such as sadness and feeling like everything is an effort. They are more than twice as likely to report serious psychological distress than those with more financial security. Despite the needs, only 1 in 3 Black adults with mental illness receive treatment. They are more likely to use the emergency room for primary care rather than mental health specialists, less likely to receive guideline consistent care, less frequently included in psychiatric and medical research. Let's look at some of the cultural beliefs that we hold that impact our help-seeking behaviors, as well as our medication compliance. When we talk about a shared cultural experience, it's the common ground that we all have because all melanated people have shared historical trauma, no matter your racial origin, that doesn't require explanation when you encounter a healthcare practitioner that is from your racial and ethnic group. It's the unspoken acknowledgement and familiarity that allows the individual dealing with the mental or behavioral health issue to pause and breathe, because they don't have to explain what is culturally significant or relevant as they manage their condition. Culture can also be a deterrent to seeking mental and behavioral health service. Cultural barriers for African Americans include different cultural perceptions about mental illness, help-seeking behaviors, and well-being. So this is not an exhaustive list. I'm pretty sure you can add to this list. But some of the things that I've heard being said is therapy is for white people. Therapy is for weak people. We all have heard that adage, you're a strong Black man or a strong Black woman, and therefore you don't really need those services. You can make it and push through, or just snap out of it. We also have to deal with and address the myths about depression. Some common misconceptions about Black Americans and depression are, why are you depressed? If our people can make it through slavery, we can make it through anything. Or you should take your troubles to Jesus, not some stranger or psychiatrist. Medication adherence. As discussed earlier, we have a history of medical experimentation abuse that can cause us to go against treatment advice. We saw a lot of this with the COVID vaccine. African Americans and BIPOC were slow adopters. We like to use complementary and alternative medications and practices and use natural products such as herbal remedies and teas and salves to treat a variety of ailments. Remember how your grandma or your mom would line you and your siblings up to give you a monthly teaspoon of castor oil to keep the GI tract clear and to ward off illness? We also use mind and body practices such as massage, acupuncture, yoga, spirituality and prayer, and energy therapies. This tends to be our first go-to when we or a loved one is not feeling well. Some people use them as adjuncts to traditional Eastern medicine, which is why physicians now ask if you're taking supplemental treatment when you go for an office visit. Negative attitudes and beliefs towards people who live with mental health conditions is pervasive within the United States and can be particularly strong within the Black community. Although beliefs and attitudes vary, research shows that many Black adults view mental health conditions as a consequence of personal weakness. As a result, it can be incredibly challenging to discuss the topic of mental health, and people may experience shame about having a mental illness and worry that they may be discriminated against due to their condition. This fear prevents them from seeking mental health care when they really need it. Additionally, many people choose to seek support from their faith community rather than seeking a psychiatric diagnosis. In many Black communities in the US, the church, mosque, or other faith institution can play a central role as a meeting place and a source of strength. Faith and spirituality can help in the recovery process and can be an important part of a treatment plan. For example, spiritual leaders and faith communities can provide support and reduce isolation for those dealing with mental illness. This option provides great comfort to individuals dealing with mental illness. However, they should not be the only option for people whose daily functioning is impaired by mental health symptoms. We talked about this previously, but it deserves a second mention. The lack of cultural competence of the healthcare practitioner can have a negative impact on those living with mental illness. This includes provider bias, both conscious and unconscious, which leads to misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment and results in mistrust, leads to a breakdown in the patient-practitioner relationship, and creates a barrier for treatment engagement. We live in a society that values and rewards work and productivity and undervalues intentional pauses, self-care, and well-being. The busyness that consumes our lives interferes with our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. What practices do we have in place to reduce the busyness and support our mental health and well-being? Think of this as we launch into the behavioral health, well-being, and self-care segment of this presentation. Behavioral health includes emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, act, make choices, and relate to others. Behavioral health is more than the absence of mental illness. It's essential to your overall health and quality of life. Self-care plays an important role in maintaining your mental health and helps support your treatment and recovery if you have a mental illness. Self-care as a holistic wellness practice for Black people includes attending to our mental health and well-being. It's been described as activities performed by an individual directed at improving or promoting overall health or general well-being. It's influenced by cultural norms or context. It's specific to the individual and their ability to do it, and assumes that they have a sense of control and autonomy in their ability to initiate and maintain self-care. Practicing self-care involves one's ability to engage in self-awareness and self-regulation as tools to develop a balance between the physical, psychological, and spiritual needs. Self-care has been a recommended intervention to minimize professional burnout and compassion fatigue and to facilitate coping with work-related and familial stress. Continual engagement in self-care leads to improved physical health outcomes, which for us is really getting a handle on diseases like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, heart disease, decreases psychological distress, and provides general life satisfaction, better family and social relationships, and career-based satisfaction. So I asked myself, if there are so many benefits to engaging in self-care, then why don't we do it? What are the barriers that interfere with our ability to engage in it? I found this conceptual model of self-care that I thought did a pretty good job of describing the behaviors, thoughts, and beliefs that interfere with our adoption of a self-care practice. Usually, self-care is discussed as a set of behaviors and strategies that one engages in to improve or sustain their health status. Common recommendations of self-care behaviors include improving sleep hygiene, exercising, consuming nutritious foods, and attending to medical needs and appointments. Other common understandings of self-care can include building interpersonal boundaries, extremely important when you have a host of competing responsibilities, priorities, and deadlines. Also, taking breaks and pauses or enjoying pleasurable activities are all considered self-care practices. This model includes 5 pillars: self-care support, orientation, motivation, skills, and behavior. Let's take the first one, self-care support. This is considered the external factors influencing the practice and engagement in self-care. It assumes that an individual knows what self-care is. Self-care is not one type fits all. It means different things to different people. It assumes that you know how to engage in a self-care practice. or that you have access or the resources for executing a self-care plan. Self-care support includes measures such as providing information, training, and resources about self-care. From a systems perspective, it requires systems, institutions, and communities to implement programs and initiatives that support self-care and that prioritize increasing self-care capacity and sustainability within the Black communities. It requires that systems, institutions, and communities respond to the unique wellness needs of Black individuals. When a decision is made to implement a wellness or self-care program, the local, cultural, health, and economic landscapes need to be considered. So an example of this is a local organization coming together to build a community garden or a farmer's market in areas where there's a food desert, or a church-based exercise, nutrition, and wellness program. Self-care orientation is a perspective one holds about engaging in self-care and how that shapes prioritizing a self-care practice in your life. Black women are often identified as caretakers in their families and communities, as well as social activist leaders for their communities. This caretaker role has historical roots in that African women were treated as commodified labor to take care of land, children, and families that did not belong to them. The caretaker role and identity for many women of color underscores the focus on taking care of others, and that's deeply ingrained and possesses a potential barrier towards a self-care orientation. There is a focus on collectivism in communities of color, in which individuals are other-oriented instead of self-oriented. In the past, many relied on this for their survival because they pooled their resources and took care of each other. This orientation to others is viewed as a strength, and that individuals are often encouraged to help or support the needs of others or the community above and beyond prioritizing the needs of self. This collectivist orientation diminishes the presence of a self-care orientation and further allows one to delay or ignore their self-care needs. Self-care motivation is a repeated practice that requires intention and is more than a one-time activity. Educating and encouraging individuals to practice self-care due to multiple wellness benefits is insufficient. Maintaining motivation to engage in healthy behaviors consistently is a barrier for many individuals, but people of color are potentially at a heightened risk. Given competing priorities, this leads to treating self-care as an afterthought, a luxury, not a self-sustaining necessity. This, coupled with an other orientation, strengthens the idea that others or the collective's needs are more important than self-needs. Black people might benefit from pre-selecting self-care activities to practice, in addition to identifying barriers that hinder self-care engagement and creating boundaries that prioritize time for self-care. Individual motivation to engage in self-care can be generated for community resources. Community wellness programs are often founded with the spirit of social justice and seek to increase opportunities for people to engage in sustainable self-care activities with others in their community. Self-care taking place in the community space can serve as a major motivation for people to maintain wellness behaviors. Self-care behaviors occur when it's initiated, practiced, and sustained. When attention is given to internal and external processes such as support, culture, orientation, motivation, and skills, individuals must move away from the idea that productivity is a priority at the expense of our self-care needs. They begin to view self-care as a practice intended for healing, well-being, and having a thriving, well-balanced life. Black people need to be encouraged to take care of their whole selves, including all areas of wellness and identity, by paying attention to all dimensions of wellness, such as the physical self, the emotional self, the social, spiritual, occupational, and financial selves, as well as their contextual environment. This also means being mindful that our whole selves are composed of multiple intersecting identities, and that may need individualized self-care behaviors that speak to the wellness of one identity. So self-care behaviors for Black people might look different than what is often advertised as self-care. For example, self-care behaviors for people of color may include engaging in an ancestral practice for spiritual self-care, or engaging in healing circles or retreats with other members in their communities that also encounter oppression and discrimination. Self-care skills helps individuals know when and how to best engage in self-care behaviors given their wellness needs. This requires a level of self-awareness, specifically regarding attention to our emotional, cognitive, physical, and spiritual state. Knowing when and how to execute self-care behaviors is a skill set that requires self-awareness coupled with practice and requires mindfulness skills. So where do you go, or how do you start? There are several self-care resources that exist, but I found an app called Liberate that provides meditations designed by Black people for the Black experience. It offers guided meditations from 5 to 25 minutes in length and talks that address the realities of the Black experience, including microaggressions, internalized racism, and ancestral healing. Liberate also has an interactive feature to foster a supportive community, and all meditations and talks are led by instructors of color. It's free unless you choose the premium subscription that's $10 per month. Look to your association. We are your professional home. I would be remiss if I did not mention that my AOTA colleagues have painstakingly curated a host of resources that support mental health, self-care, and well-being in your practice, for yourself, has continuing education for those who want to increase their knowledge and skill set, mental and behavioral health resources that include official documents, toolkits, and decision guides, articles and books, as well as advocacy efforts and resources. We are here to support you professionally, as well as in your well-being and self-care practice. I know I'm aging myself, but as Tom Cruise said to Cuba Gooding and Jerry Maguire, help us to help you. We are here for you. At a minimum, engage in a practice that fulfills you, brings you joy, makes you pause. I want to share 2 to 3 minutes of this clip that just makes my soul sing. So I thought it was apropos for this presentation.
About to frolic. Why you ain't tell me we was frolicking? What? Oh, we frolicking? That's what we do? We frolicking? Let me get my frolic on. Oh. I know we was out here frolicking. Frolicking, huh? We frolicking. Frolic on. Oh, we frolicking? Okay. They're very Black man's brother. Oh. No.
So that video really excites me. It makes my heart sing, because for me to see Black men having fun, taking some time out, and just engaging in a practice, a pause practice that allows them to regenerate and rejuvenate their souls, it just makes me happy to see that. and I hope that you guys see this as the beginning or a way to kind of take, an opportunity to go out there today and then to engage in your own personal self-care practice and to engage in some frolicking. So I can entertain any questions that anybody may have about anything that was presented thus far. And I thank you for your attention and listening to what I had to share.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Salvant. Everyone, please, if you can go ahead and reach into your reactions tab and please put a round of applause. That was an excellent, flawless presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, as previously mentioned, if you have any questions, put that in the chat as me and Dr. Servant, Dr. Servant and I will go ahead and interact with those questions. While people are formulating, really just reflecting on that content and trying to just put together sentences. One question that I have while people are doing that is the perception that individuals who sort of go through all that we discussed. So this trauma, a lot of individuals assume that it's those who are uneducated, those who don't know better, those who don't have degrees, those who don't have access to textbooks and so on and so forth. But literature really points to like consistency, those who have education, those who don't. And my question is, really, why is it that Black and Brown individuals still struggle to seek out resources, even though those resources are there, specifically professionals? We all here are professionals or soon to be professionals, and we belong to organizations who have an employee assistance program. Now, within the last 3 years, those programs have been booming. Really, it would be a shock as to why a company wouldn't have a program like that. But still, literature points and says there's still that struggle. Individuals still don't go out and do it, and yet we should know better. So what is that barrier? What is that hiccup on our part, especially as professionals, especially as some of us may say are empaths, because occupational therapists really take on so much emotionally, physically for our patients, and yet we are left drained. So why is it that we and many individuals still struggle to seek out and utilize those benefits, even though we are fortunate to say that we have them now?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I feel like I have to do my presentation all over again, because it's a myriad of issues, stemming from a lot of that historical trauma that we had, So, for example, I have an aunt, because you talked about education, who suffers with hypertension, who has 2 master's degrees. So she's educated and decides to take her hypertensive medication when she has the symptoms. We all know as healthcare practitioners that it's a silent killer, but that's the belief pattern that she has. So some of those thoughts and beliefs and myths are ingrained, into our psyche. Some of the historical trauma that we have, because remember, I started off by talking about the medical experimentation and the racism that existed there. So it's going to take a long time, I think, as people like us start to assume more positions of power. You go into a facility or you see more. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to see more people who look like us that become mental health practitioners, because there really is something to be said about being able to go see a mental health practitioner who looks like you, who understands you, and who understands a historical trauma that all melanated people have gone through. So you don't have to explain that, So as you're talking to the mental health specialist, you don't say something to them. They say, well, and they tell you to do something that goes directly against what your cultural belief patterns and your cultural norms are. Because what most of us will do is, if we make it into an office of a mental health specialist, is we're done with that, because we're like, this person can't help me because they can't really relate to what I'm trying to tell them. But I think there are a lot of factors that really interfere with our ability to seek mental health services, whether or not we have a mental illness or not. Coupled with, many of us do not engage in self-care practices. Many of us don't.
Yeah, yes, I couldn't agree more. And sometimes, unfortunately, it takes getting down to the lower rock bottom before we realize, wow, I need to practice what I'm preaching.
But you know something, I would go on to say though, the rock bottom for us, we need to figure out how not to get there, because we're the ones that are dying at a higher rate with diabetes, hypertension leading to strokes, so we have a lot of, morbidity and mortality as a result of us not taking intentional pauses and breaks and engaging in self-care.
Excellent, excellent. A question that we have here is, what are the cultural considerations, or what cultural considerations should occupational therapists keep in mind when working with African American clients who have mental health concerns?
So I think if you are not from that racial and ethnic group, I would just, we practice cultural humility, right? You don't make any assumptions. So if the person who has an actual mental illness and they actively have symptoms, they have active symptoms, then you use their family and support system as a resource to figure out what are some of the things, that's what the occupational profile is for. You're engaging with the client to find out what things are important to them. What does the treatment plan look like? How should you guys work together in order to engage them in participating in that treatment plan? If the individual has an active illness at that time, it would be similar to someone who has a physical ailment and they're unresponsive. You would go to their loved ones, their caretakers, and say, what is important to this person? How can I connect with them?
Good, thank you. Another question that we have from Dr. Jackson is, can you speak to some of the challenges and changes in the works the works to return OT to our roots of being mental health providers?
I'm sorry, say again, say that question again.
Can you speak to some of the challenges and changes in the works to return OT to our roots of being mental health providers?
Okay, so I guess this person is saying basically, because our philosophical base was in mental health. That's how OT started. And we've kind of deviated from that, over the years. And now there's a resurgence, I guess. So I think COVID was a bad thing and a good thing, right? Because COVID caused everyone in the United States, in the world really, to realize that mental illness and mental health is a really important issue for all to pay attention to. And there's been this increased need in mental health practitioners. So don't quote me because I do not work in that department, but I know my colleagues that work in policy are actively working towards getting bills or getting OTs written into bills so that you are therefore reimbursed for mental health practice. So that if you're looking, and not necessarily in a hospital, because for the most part, that's really not where we spend the bulk of our practice. It's in the community. So that you're able to go and you can get paid and reimbursed for providing mental health services. So I think that surge is coming for those who are interested in going back and, going back to our philosophical base and our philosophical roots and really providing OT services in a mental health, not necessarily traditional hospital setting, but in a community setting, it's there, but sometimes it's also making inroads, going in and showing what you're able to do. Because we do so many things, because we're OTs, sometimes people have a difficult time trying to understand exactly what it is that we do.
Excellent. Thank you. I couldn't agree more, especially with, again, so many things that we have the potential to do. And it puts sometimes really undue burden because we want to save everyone. And we want to go ahead and provide resources and do so much. But really, as you mentioned in your presentation, reaching out and leaning on to our professional association, both at the state level, the regional level, and the national level, and realizing that we're not alone in combating all of the things that we see that we want to help with. Another question that we have here is, how can occupational therapy support the mental health and well-being of African-American clients who are dealing with the effects of not only historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, but present current trauma, such as negative police interactions within the Black community?
You said, how can that was a very long question. How can occupational therapy, you said?
Yes, how can occupational therapy support the mental health and well-being of African-American clients who are dealing with the effects of not only historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, but present current trauma, such as negative police interactions within the Black community?
So I think that's the $1 million question. The first thing that comes top of mind to me is, because I definitely don't have all the answers related to this, is that I think creating a safe space where someone has the ability, to come, because we deal on a daily basis, with all these different, with oppression on a daily basis, and sometimes we move through life as if, it's more of a nuisance, more so than this is something that has cumulative impact, right? In terms of microaggressions and stuff like that. But I think if you're able to create a safe space where someone who is a person of color, African-American, can come in, they have a session with you, and you allow them the freedom just to talk about some of the traumas that they're facing, that it's kind of cathartic, I think. And then it allows you to then be able to get at the heart of, okay, this is what's going on. Your experiences are real. I understand. I may not understand those experiences because I may not have had similar experiences, but I can definitely empathize with you. It's your basic therapeutic use of self that we learned when we were in school. You are using yourself to empathize with the client and to have an experience with them. I think many times what we do is we try, especially when you're dealing with someone who is not from the same racial and ethnic background, you shut them down because they start to say, this is my experience, this is what's happening, the police, I do feel afraid of the police. And if you're not from that group and you don't really understand their daily struggles, you shut it down and you say, you minimize it. Blue lives matter. That's one way, just kind of summarize it. And you're not really giving that person an opportunity to tell them what those fears look like to them and how it adversely impacts them on a daily basis and how that causes, psychological trauma.
Wow, yes, thank you so much. And I think, again, over the last few years, those things have come up in forced discussion, which we are happy for. And then this is the last question. What are some ways we can encourage our profession to better immerse these topics into OT curricula? As a relatively new practitioner, some of the historical knowledge presented today was new to me. All of what was touched upon today relates to occupational participation and engagement. And I would love to see more of this information provided to emerging practitioners and students. So again, what are some ways we can encourage our profession to better immerse these topics into OT curricula?
So so in terms of OT curricula, entry-level practice, when we're looking at the association, AOTA deals with post-professional education. They set their standards for professional, the professional standards, but ACOTE, which is the Accreditation Council for Occupational Therapy Education, they set the standards for entry-level education. So what I would say to you is right now, they're looking at revising the new standards that will be used by all academic institutions, right? They're going to do a call, look to see what they put. B standards are your curriculum standards. These are the standards that say or mandate, these are the types of courses you need to teach for entry-level practice. look at what that call, look at the new standards and the revisions that have been made, and you can make comments. Anyone can make comments. It's not a specific, anyone could send in an email, a letter to say, why don't we have more of? And you let the committee that's working on the standards work on that. Now, what I would say is it's interesting that the person said that there was a lot of information they didn't know. I knew a lot of some of that bulk information in terms of public health because I've been around it before. I didn't know a lot of the historical stuff. So when I started doing this, I said, I want to understand why are we like this, you know? As I was explaining this to my boss, he said, why don't you make that into a continuing education? I never even thought to do that. So this, for me, and maybe this will be one of many, would be to create something so that people who are seeking this kind of information, they actually have access to it. I would also say, I keep telling you guys, we are your professional home. If there's something you feel needs to be developed, reach out and partner with us. I work for the knowledge division, which isn't, so I'm in charge of continuing education. Reach out and say, hey, is there a subject matter expert that we can engage that would be able to develop this type of information? Because you may not be able to change the standards, for entry-level education, but we definitely have more latitude and flexibility in terms of developing professional development products and resources.
Excellent, excellent. And so again, it's harping at something I'm always saying: network, introduce yourself, connect, and don't be afraid to throw out an idea and be adventurous about what we want to go ahead and take this profession to. Thank you so much, Dr. Salvant. Thank you. Those words truly, it does not measure up to what you brought us today. And thank you for your work and your commitment to the profession and your continued work. And so right now, everyone, one thing that I want to say regarding this conference is, if there's one word that you need to remember, is that it's dynamic. Our conference today is dynamic. And so we're going to go into a dynamic portion, which is a breakout session. It's going to go ahead and allow for open discussion. It is going to allow for student-led discussions. It's going to allow for professional-led discussions to talk about your experience. This breakout session is not recorded. To honor your privacy, to honor your words. So in a few moments or seconds, you will all be put into a breakout room, respective of your current status, whether you are a student or a professional. We will have roughly 40 minutes within that dynamic period. Don't be shy, speak up. This is the time to go ahead and engage and just to have some curiosity regarding the content, regarding what we just received, okay? And then we'll go ahead and we'll be back as a large group session for our other speakers in the conference today. All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. I am confident that those sessions were rich in discussion. I'm sure that there were moments of transparency, suggestions, strategies for success, whether currently going through occupational therapy school or just continuing to be successful as an active practitioner. And so I have no doubt that, again, that dynamic aspect of our conference was indeed engaging and being able to connect with people and hearing, most importantly, that, wow, they have the same similar experience as I do. They share similar feelings. And most importantly, they're offering strategies that I never thought would work, or just honestly never thought of. And so I'm very thankful for that. We're going to go ahead and proceed. Before we just have a moment of break, we're going to go back to Dr. Salvant just to quickly summarize and respond to maybe just one question, but most importantly, just to summarize and add, again, if you will, the cherry on top of the sundae. Dr. Savant, the floor is yours.
So I listened in on both of the breakout rooms. And what I could say is I saw some emerging themes. So students, that ran the sessions, if I get it wrong, please jump in. I don't have a problem with that and correct me. But some of the things that I heard of, I think I heard about one, two, maybe about 5 or 6 different themes. So one of them had to do with self-love, right? And part of self-love had a lot of, one person said, I make sure I say no, so saying no and utilizing that as a strategy to create those boundaries so that you're not so burnt out, professionally as well as in your personal life. Someone said saying yes to me, that was, their self-love. Other people described activities that they engaged in. So someone talked about, finding an occupation that gives you, joy. So they talked about using the sauna, physical activities, video games, so now I don't feel so bad that Netflix is my go-to because I let my brain decompress like that. But doing things that bring you joy, engaging in that self-love. And as I said before, it will look different for everybody. A lot of people talked about, or another emerging theme was the support system. So I saw that as 2 different aspects of a support system. So one had to do with creating this inner circle. Someone said something, and I thought it was great. They said, not all kinfolk, how'd it go? Not all, not all kinfolk, all skinfolk aren't kinfolk. Right. And I thought that was really, important because sometimes we look for people who look like us, and sometimes people who look like us are supports and they're mentors, but sometimes there are allies that we wouldn't think would be our allies, and they really are in our corner. So it's really being selective, and intentional about who you allow within that inner circle because they truly are your support system. Then I heard a lot about professional mentorship as a support system, so making sure that when you enter into the work environment, that there are people who look like you that could kind of mentor you as you go on your professional journey. So it was two-tiered. You had a personal journey and a professional journey, all leading to that support system. Then people talked about the coping strategies, which I mentioned some of them before. And then one person talked about acceptance and acknowledgement of mental illness, because it's still a stigmatized, taboo type of thing within our community, and really embracing that, because we do have mental illness in our communities. And if we can embrace it, then we can truly provide the appropriate support systems that they need so that it's episodic and not a continual, constant thing. Creating safe spaces. So people talk about, if you can't find a safe space, this is for the students within your classroom, because we are in a predominantly white female profession, that sometimes if you're at a PWI, they may be a greater or an organization that exists for the overarching institution that you can be a part of, where you can get your support. Or I believe there was a fieldwork coordinator from Howard, I recognized her, who said that, students should not stay silent. You shouldn't be at fieldwork suffering and not saying that these things are bothering you, that you really should have someone you can go to basically divulge those things that bother you on a daily basis. Keeping silent for us, I think, is kind of like creating those gradual traumas that eventually lead to a bigger thing, and that's how we end up with so many of these chronic conditions, because we tend to hold a lot of these things in. And with the safe spaces was this whole idea of being the only. So therefore looking outside of that to try and expand your circle, to look for your support systems. So those were the major things that I heard from both of the, oh, and the other thing in terms of mentorship was also joining your professional organization, whether it's a national organization or your state organization or an organization like this one, just finding a professional organization to join and organizations do different things. So you may belong to a couple of them, and that will complete your whole circle. I think I got everything. So student facilitators, if I forget anything, please jump in at this point and help a sister out. That would be great.
Before I step off, because I do have to go a little early, one of the things that I thought was very important was saying that a safe space is created, meaning like it's not just going to be given to you. Sometimes you have to create that safe space or let people know what it is that you require from them, because a person can assume that you're being the most safest, most supportive, most supportive person ever, and you may not feel like that. So it's important to tell the person what you need, tell the person what you're asking for, low-key demand what you need, like, because sometimes we don't speak up, and sometimes people are assuming what they think is the correct or like the most political way to support a person, but until you let someone know what it is that you need, they'll never know. So creating that safe space takes time and is intentional, and I think we kind of talked about just having like that safe space created and not automatically assuming that it's going to be given. But I had a great time. This was amazing. And I thank everybody for who was in my group. Thank you for participating. And you guys are awesome. So thank you guys. I appreciate everybody.
Excellent, excellent. Any other student facilitators want to chime in? That's fine. We got about a minute left before we transition.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone in general for being vulnerable and open and listening to each other, as well as sharing your experiences. A lot of times, talking through this stuff and about this stuff isn't easy, but I just want to thank everyone.
Yes, I agree. I'm also another facilitator. I think something that was really beautifully said by some of my participants was that be unapologetically yourself, and then build that self-efficacy, because you're going to get challenges regardless of being a student, being a practitioner, being a scholar, and just having that self-worth, bring that into the room so that you deserve a seat at the table. That helps you with your mental health too. And I thought that was a beautiful sentiment to share. So.
Yeah, I would also like to piggyback and just say thank you for everyone to being so involved in the discussions. Two of the most takeaways that I took from the discussion is that someone said that being an African American is a strength, and that we should play on our strengths and mobilize our resources. That was something that stood out to me a lot. And also learning how to say no and saying yes to yourself, not to over stress yourself and things like that. So I really do appreciate you guys' input. It was really instrumental to my life.
Excellent, excellent. And most importantly, thank you, students, as well as honestly future leaders, in being engaging and being part of this. One thing, make no mistake, we want engagement. The earlier, the better. We want to start leadership development while you're in your programs. It's going to encourage you. It's going to give you energy and maintain that energy to get involved. Right now, before we transition to our next speaker, Dr. Faison, her presentation will start at 12:10. So we have a few minutes just to transition that time. So if anybody wants to go ahead, grab some water, use the restroom before that presentation, now is the time while we go ahead and set things up and set up her presentation. Okay, so we have until 12:10. Please be back on here 12:10 so we can go ahead and start the next presentation. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, welcome back. Just in time for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Faison, who is the Director of Occupational Therapy at Sheppard Pratt Rehab and Recovery and Clinical Assistant Professor at Howard University. Dr. Faison is an experienced and accomplished health services leader with 29 years of experience of diverse clinical and management experiences. She is the Director of Occupational Therapy at Sheppard Pratt Rehab and Recovery Division. She also serves as Clinical Assistant Professor in the Howard University Doctorate of Occupational Therapy program and as an advisory board member and adjunct instructor for the Occupational Therapy Assistant Program at the Community College of Baltimore County, where she teaches curricula on psychosocial dysfunctions. Dr. Faison received her bachelor's degree in occupational therapy from Howard University, a master's degree in healthcare administration from the University of Maryland Global Campus, and her post-professional doctorate of occupational therapy from Townsend University. She was recently nominated by the Occupational Therapy Science Department at Townsend University as a featured alumni from the Post-Professional Occupational Therapy Doctorate Program. The nomination was in recognition of her achievements as a recent student, in particular, the awarding of the Terminal Degree Fellowship and her timely and captivating capstone project, which focused on trauma-informed care and the perceived competence of fieldwork students. Dr. Faison is passionate about excellence in service delivery and client-centered care. She seeks to foster positivity, leadership, and professional identity development in the students and practitioners she serves. Please, everyone, without hesitation, please reach down into the reactions and give Dr. Faison her flowers. Go ahead and send hearts. Go ahead and send applause. Dr. Faison, we are so glad and honored that you are here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley. I really appreciate those kind words. And good afternoon to everybody. I am so honored and excited to be a part of today's event. Thank you to the National Black Caucus. Thank you to Ms. Jerry Bentley for reaching out. Thank you to the BROTHAS organization. And I'm just delighted to be here. I'm not going to stay before you too long, but I do want to share with you. So if you just give me a moment, I am going to share my screen and then we can get started. So my title for my presentation today is Normalizing the Conversation, the Misnomers of Mental Illness. I tend to gravitate toward catchy titles. And so hopefully today I will be able to share with you all, just some of my perspectives and reflections as it relates to mental health and mental illness. As you heard during the reading of my bio, I am in the clinic space, I am in the classroom space. So I get to see it from a couple different sides. I was just going to say there was an echo that I heard, but I think we're good now. So my goal for today for the presentation, again, is to be able to share and to enlighten on such, and I think we all can agree, such an important topic. By the end of the presentation, my hope is that everyone who has been a part of the presentation can ask themselves, what have I done? What am I doing? And what more can I do to begin to normalize the conversations about mental health and mental illness, and at the same time dimming the light surrounding the stigma of mental illness. So what is mental health? I think all of us as practitioners or soon to be practitioners may have a strong sense, or at least we think we do, of what mental health encompasses. The CDC defines mental health by saying that it includes not only our emotional or psychological, but also our social well-being. It affects how we think, how we feel, how we act. It helps to determine how we handle and manage stress, how we relate to other individuals, and it also influences the decisions that we make. Mental health is important in every stage of our lives, from childhood to adolescence, and even into and through adulthood. And there are certainly factors that contribute to mental health problems, such as biological, genetics, our life experiences, trauma, abuse, as well as family history. And I think it's really important to understand, and we've heard it said earlier in the presentation today, that our mental health is equally as important as our physical health to our overall health and well-being. So let's take a moment. I want to start by distinguishing mental health and mental illness. I think more people than not tend to use it interchangeably, but poor mental health and mental illness is not the same. Mental health implies that there is an absence of illness or disorder, whereas on the other hand, mental illness is a diagnosable disorder with a standard of set criteria. And certainly it can be caused by factors, like I mentioned earlier, as genetics, trauma, brain chemistry, so forth and so on. A person can experience poor mental health and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. And conversely, a person with a mental illness can experience periods of physical, mental, and social well-being. Mental illness complicates mental health by affecting the way the person feels, thinks, and acts, or experiences the world. Mental health affects all people. We all have a state of mental health, while only some of us experience a diagnosed mental illness. So I want to share or highlight, some facts about mental illness. And you may recall that Dr. Salvant did review some statistics in her presentation as well. So some of it might be just a reiteration of what she said. 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness each year. 1 in 20 US adults experience serious mental illness each year. 1 in 6 US youth aged 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. And 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by the age of 14, where it's 75% by the age of 24. Dr. Salvant also touched on suicide statistics, and I'll just add here that it's the second leading cause of death among people ages 10 to 14, and the 10th leading cause of death for all ages. So just to put it into even more specific perspective, I want to highlight mental health facts specifically relating to African Americans. According to the census data, 13.4% of the US population identifies as Black or African American. And of those, over 16% reported having a mental illness in the past year, according to SAMHSA. And SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. This equates to over 7 million people. Overall, mental health conditions occur in Black and African American people at about the same or less frequency than in white Americans. I'm going to read that again. Mental health conditions occur in Black and African American people at about the same or less frequency than in white Americans. So you might be asking, how can that be? And Dr. Salvant alluded to this as well. Our lived experiences are vastly different. The historical Black and African American experience in America has and continues to be characterized by trauma and violence more often than for our white counterparts. And it also has a greater negative impact on the emotional and mental health of both youth and adults. Black adults in the US are more likely than white adults to report persistent symptoms of emotional distress, whereas in white Americans, it's episodic. And so we have this continual cycle of trauma, of stress, depression, anxiety. And so the symptoms just continue to exist. Only 1 in 3 Black adults with mental illness receive treatment. And there are certain factors that influence, the lack of treatment, as well as, the persistent and symptoms of emotional distress. One such factor is historical adversity. This goes back as far as slavery. And in addition to that, there are race-based exclusions from health, educational, social, and economic resources. And this translates into socioeconomic disparities experienced by Black and African American people today. Another factor is socioeconomic status, which is linked to mental health. More Black and African Americans find themselves in impoverished states, dealing with homelessness, incarceration, or have substance abuse problems. And this puts them at a higher risk for poor mental health. And then there are negative stereotypes. And even though the attitudes of rejection have decreased, it still continues to occur with measurable adverse consequences that affect Black and African Americans disproportionately. And then finally, the last factor that I want to highlight is the historical and contemporary instances of negative treatment. This has led to a mistrust of authorities, law enforcement, the legal system, and many of whom are not seen as having the best interest of Black and African Americans in mind. I also want to point out here, as it relates to mental health in African Americans, more likely, many more of us are going to be using the emergency room or primary care rather than mental health specialists. And we are less likely to receive guideline consistent care, which affects our overall outcomes. So going back to my title, Misnomers about mental health. And so I titled it Misnomers about Mental Illness. The message that I'm trying to convey here with the title is that mental health is shrouded in misperceptions and misconceptions about mental illness, mental health, all of which lead to stigma that surrounds mental health. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some misconceptions about mental health that I want all of us to think about. It is not normal to struggle. Misconceptions prevent people from getting the help that they need. As a race, as a people, we are resilient. And in fact, in the breakout session, I heard one of the individuals just remind the students that we are resilient as a people, as a race, as a culture. But we are infamous for pushing through, for making it happen. But what does it cost us? And oftentimes it costs, or the expense is, our mental health, our mental well-being. Given that the rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders are on the rise, continued stigma causes people to suffer in silence, needlessly. Part of breaking the stigma is openly discussing the fact that many people will need mental health support at some point in their lives. Another misconception is that people should be able to handle mental health issues on their own. Along with the lines of pushing through, many see depression as something that one can just snap out of. And, you know, a lot of us who are spiritual or religious, you know, the notion of we'll pray about it, we'll take it to God. And certainly I, as a believer, feels that, you know, God put people and these other resources to help us, you know, as if like if we were going to the, you know, a medical doctor for a physical ailment, there is treatment for our mental concerns and mental conditions as well. If you were to break your arm, no one's going to expect you to just deal with the pain until it heals. So just like we would seek care from a physician for a physical ailment, we should have the same expectation around receiving treatment for our mental illness or mental health issues. Another misconception is that mental health disorders are a sign of weakness or a lack of willpower. Mental disorders are a medical condition, just like diabetes, just like heart disease, and any other physical health problem. They can be caused by a variety of factors, like I mentioned earlier, genetics, the environment, life experiences like trauma. And fortunately, this misnomer is gradually disappearing as the awareness of mental illness grows, but we need to continue having the conversation. And then the last one, mental health care is only for people with severe problems. Everyone has mental health. We distinguished at the start of the presentation. And even if you don't have a diagnosable mental health condition, like say depression, anxiety, and other extreme mental health conditions, if you have mental health struggles that are on the milder end of the spectrum, such as stress, you still can benefit from mental health support. And if therapy isn't a thing for you, because it's not for everyone, there are other ways that we can bolster our mental health, such as mental health coaching, self-care apps. We all heard Dr. Salvant, share an app that she was familiar with. And so there are other options out there. And then also including healthy lifestyle changes, getting more sleep, changing our diet, incorporating some exercise, and just being around a community of individuals that you care about and that support you overall. So many of us are familiar with early warning signs of mental health, or may not be, but I think it bears repeating. So I want to reiterate them here yet again, so we all can just continually have an awareness of when things might be off with someone that we know, or even with our own selves. And so you can see here just a list of some early warning signs. I think it's important to kind of point out as well, just, we're all busy. We're all lifing it. We're all trying to get through on a daily basis. Sometimes we don't even have enough time for ourselves, more or less, paying attention to other people. But I think it's imperative and important to at least, have the conversation, put it on the table, remind individuals that we have to pause and check on the people that are in our circles. We talk about suicide and the rates, and then we hear the stories when things happen in terms of everything seemed fine, but everything wasn't fine. And so I want you to take a moment and just, look through the early warning signs and just begin to familiarize yourself with them, because you never know when you are the individual that can help to save someone's life. There is an artist, her name, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Libianca. She is a Cameroonian American Afrobeat singer. Some of you all may know her. She was on The Voice in 2021. And she wrote a song in 2022 called People. I generally don't listen to the words of songs. I'm, just to the beat. And this Afrobeats, if you know anything about that type of music, you can just vibe out to the beat of the music. And so I really like the song. But then one day I was listening to an interview with her on the radio, and she was talking about her struggle with mental illness. She has a diagnosis of cyclothymia. And for those of you who don't know, cyclothymia is a mental health condition, disorder, very similar, but on a milder form of bipolar disorder. And so there is mood shifts, but they aren't as extreme as individuals with a diagnosis of bipolar, and people can still function, although it may be difficult for them to do so. And so after hearing that, I went back and I listened to the words of the song. And some of the words of the song she says, "I've been drinking more alcohol for the past 5 days. Did you check on me? Now, did you look for me? I walked in the room, my eyes are red, but I don't smoke banga. Did you check on me? Now, did you notice me?" And when I listened to the words of the song, it made me think about mental health, mental illness, the increase, the rise in the suicide rates, and what I just said in terms of everything seemed fine on the surface. But did you check on me? Did you check on them? Did you ask for them? Did you notice them? Again, we're all so busy in our day-to-day lives. Sometimes we don't pause to, take note of what's happening in those that we care about that are around us, or those that are in the spaces that we are in. So if you have an opportunity, listen to that song. It has a great beat, but more importantly, the words. And I hope that the words resonate with you as much as it did with me. So we can't change the world overnight, but what we can be is more intentional about having conversations and doing so in a manner that provides individuals with the utmost level of respect. Part of that is in how we express ourselves, the words we use, and how we reference individuals. Being in clinic spaces as well as classroom spaces, but particularly in the clinic space, I'm always guiding students in terms of the words that they use, the word choices that they make, how they frame people. I tell them all the time, words matter. I say to them, Be mindful how you frame someone, the words that you use, the word choice, because it's going to be a part of their medical record and it will follow them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes, and very unintentionally, students, their documentation, their notes reflects some bias, some judgment. And so we have to edit it. And I offer, kinder, gentler, words that don't seem so harsh. And I just tell students, you don't know what you don't know. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a space where I can mentor and mold and help shape minds and the thinking. And particularly when I have students who are not of color, maybe in an urban environment, in one of my clinical settings, I am intentional to create opportunities that they may not have experienced so that they get to see it from another side. I'm also very intentional to say, you're going to have opportunities that maybe others who don't look like you will not have. Create opportunities for them, create a space at the table. And if there's not a chair, pull one up for them, do it for them. And students get what I'm saying. I say it hopefully in the most gentle of ways. Even, I'm rah-rah pro-Black, but certainly I try to be diplomatic because again, I'm modeling for them what it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, what it means to hold space for someone who may not look like them. And so not creating a space that feels safe enough for someone to express themselves doesn't allow for the conversation to be had. It's about respect, 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 respect with our words, respect how we show up, respect that we don't dismiss people, certainly people with mental health challenges, mental illness. And so I am quick to bring that to the surface when a student might appear a bit dismissive. And so that they can see in that moment how it could make another person feel. We're all humans. And so I want to leave with you just a few commandments, I will call them, about how to talk about mental health. I think it's important that we all understand that we have to put the person first. It's not the illness, it's the person. So an individual has schizophrenia as opposed to she's schizophrenic or she's bipolar. Don't say medically disabled, mentally handicapped, or mentally ill. Instead, say they have a mental illness or mental health condition, since many people who deal with mental health concerns do not have a formal diagnosis. Don't use diagnostic or mental health terms to explain individual idiosyncrasies. And I think many of us can be guilty of that. Oh, it's my ADHD kicking in, or oh, that's my OCD kicking in. But certainly we want to be mindful again of how we frame things. Don't be insensitive or use insensitive terms like crazy, insane, psycho, deranged to describe unusual behavior or violent behaviors, or someone who might be having a mental health or mental health crises. And then finally, don't say committed suicide. Instead, died by suicide. The term committed refers to the notion that the act of suicide is a crime. And so certainly we want to be respectful in that manner. So just a few important takeaways that I think is important, and certainly I want to leave with you. We must be continue to be advocates for our patients, for our clients, but also for ourselves. By having authentic conversations, we give people hope. And that's when change can happen. Mental health conditions can affect anyone, no matter what our job titles are, no matter what our positions in society is. Having a mental health condition is not a requirement for greatness, but it's not an exclusion. People can be successful managing their day-to-day lives with a mental health condition, with a mental illness, mental health diagnosis, on the right regimen of medication, support therapy, talk therapy, whatever the treatment of their choice becomes, they still can be successful. I think we have to continue to advocate, holding policymakers and health systems accountable to evolve better systems which eliminate the inequities in mental health services. And being willing to lead conversations from a very authentic place. Again, this is where hope lives and change happens. And as I stated in the beginning of the presentation, let's ask ourselves, what have I done? What am I doing? And what more can I do to begin to normalize having conversations about mental illness? I want to share just some Black mental health resources, and I'm emphasizing Black. It is Black History Month. Happy Black History Month to everyone. So these are just some resources that I was able to identify, and hopefully they might be useful. Put them in I tell students, put them in your toolbox. You never know when you might use them for yourself or be able to share them with, a family member, a patient, a client, or whomever. And certainly, hopefully, the team that put the presentation together today will be able to share our slides if you're interested so that you can, again, see this list here. And then, of course, we may be more familiar with some other mental health resources, including NAMI, SAMHSA, National Council for Mental Wellbeing, so forth and so on. And these are my references. And now I will stop my share and I'll entertain any questions that anyone has.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Faison. Thank you for your time and the content. Thank you so much. As previous, the same method, we do have time for one question. So if we can go ahead and one or two questions, can you go ahead and the audience place that in the chat for us? And the presentation will also be recorded as well. So if individuals also have additional questions, we'll go ahead and we'll send them your way too. But everyone, if you can go ahead again, a round of applause as well for Dr. Faison and her presentation. A question that I have while people are formulating is what interventions and assessments, perhaps assessments is the proper word, do you find yourself using more in the clinic in relation to working with individuals who may have a concern for mental health, or we notice that, or they have a diagnosis of a mental illness? What assessments do you find yourself using? Because as a provider myself, I find that the assessments are everywhere and there are biases that are in them. So if you wouldn't mind speaking, what assessments do you find yourself using within practice and educating students on?
Yes, and so good question. You mentioned earlier that I do work for Shepherd Pratt. I work in the Community Services Division. And so I basically I oversee day programs, community day programs. And so we have clients coming in on a daily basis, and I have students in the various clinics. I would say the most common assessments that we use are the COPAM, the Managed Screen. We use the ACLS, interest role checklist. I would say those are the primary of the ones that we use, but I am always encouraging students to seek out unfamiliar assessments, because there are a lot of them that exist out there. But I certainly understand and hear you when you talk about the biases that is built into some of the assessments that do exist. And so again, my choice of assessments primarily that we use, of course, are related to getting individuals or seeing where they are in terms of their functionality and abilities related to their cognitive and/or mental health challenges, and being able to live in the community and how much support they may need.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that as well. And also thank you for the song suggestion. It's a beautiful song. It comes up on the radio. And just like you mentioned, often we will listen to the beat, especially Afro beats, where we just vibe to it. But when we stop and listen, just what comes to mind is, oh, wow, like they have such a powerful story. And thank you so much for that. And thank you, Dr. Faison, again, for your time, for the content, for your work and your continued work.
Thank you.
Everyone, if you can go ahead, a round of applause for Dr. Faison. And during that, we're going to transition to Dr. Cynthia Hoskins. So our next speaker, Dr. Cynthia Hoskins, Texas Occupational Therapy Association Co-Chair Mental Health and Behavioral Health ABHABIC Committee. Dr. Hoskins received her Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology with a minor in sociology from Texas A&M University, her master's degree in occupational therapy from Texas Women's University, and her doctorate degree in behavioral health with a clinical concentration from Arizona State University. Dr. Hoskins has been licensed and registered as an occupational therapist for 27 plus years and recently held the position of rehabilitation education specialist and senior occupational therapist on the psychiatric unit at Houston Methodist Hospital in Texas, a medical center for 8 years. Dr. Hoskins has experience working in inpatient, acute, outpatient, skilled, and school-based settings, and has over 15 combined years of experience working directly with patients who have a wide range of serious mental health disorders. She has done extensive research on sleep disturbances and the impact on mental health, and has received training in cognitive behavioral therapy for the treatment of insomnia. Dr. Hoskins currently holds a certification in the treatment of individual trauma, is CANS and ANSA certified, is certified in youth mental health first aid, CPI trained, and is a certified AAU track and field coach. Dr. Hoskins is a clinical instructor and has over 23 years of experience working with students at all levels, to include working as contributing faculty for psychosocial fieldwork. She has served as a mentor for an occupational therapy fellowship program, has provided lectures on mental health and empathy and compassion, has many years of experience with emotional regulation, and served as a trainer for sensory modulation and a preceptor for interdisciplinary staff. Dr. Hoskins has a passion for student teaching, trauma-informed care, and working with those who have been faced with behavioral health challenges. Dr. Hoskins enjoys student interactions, coaching, leisure writing, and dancing, and has lived in Texas long enough to be called a Texan. Everyone, please go ahead. A round of applause for Dr. Hoskins. Dr. Hoskins, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, first and foremost, can you hear me? All right, we're cooking with grease. All right, well, thank you all for having me. I am super excited to be here and speak with you briefly about mental health and why it's so important to incorporate this into our treatment and our care. You probably will hear some repeated themes, but that's okay, because I think it's so important that we really focus on this component, because we've had such a paradigm shift away from addressing this issue that I think is so important that we kind of reach back and kind of go back to our roots and begin to address these issues. So I'm super excited to be here, and I won't be before you long. And then I'll leave the floor open for you guys to if you have any questions. So first of all, the overview. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where do we start? You know, we talk a lot about mental health and why it's so important, especially within our space. But, you know, as OTs and as therapists in general, where do we start? And then I'm going to talk about mental health, why it's so important, what factors are incorporated into that definition, and why it's so important that we address it. We're going to talk about a little bit about statistics. And then what can we do as therapists? How can we incorporate some of those strategies? I heard Dr. Dudley mention about some of the assessments, and how can we incorporate and what can we do to make sure that we address this particular component within whatever practice practice setting that we're in. And then how those approaches can actually improve the patient's experience. So first things first. Now I have an awesome colleague that's going to talk about advocacy, but the first thing we need to do is understand that this is something that we can do. Understanding where we started, as OTs, we started in mental health. And I think when we understand that, we know that this is an area that we can address, that we are equipped to address, that this makes a clear lens into not only what we're currently doing, but also for our future. We also need to understand the language. I oftentimes hear, for example, behavioral health and mental health used interchangeably. And although mental health falls under or is a part of behavioral health is actually an overarching umbrella that encompasses not only mental health, but you're looking at physical health, environmental health, cognitive, emotional, all those factors that impact our overall well-being. So we need to make sure as we move forward and we start addressing these issues that we understand the language. I think as OTs, that's what we do anyway. We address the behavior. We address whatever behaviors that actually impact how that patient is functioning. We are a whole person, flexible and purpose-driven profession. So we have to look at the whole person. Oftentimes you may have a client who is not reaching their full potential as far as their goals are concerned or their functional capacity because there may be an underlying mental illness that we haven't addressed. And I think OTs, we're kind of in a unique position to really bridge that gap, to really look at, how can I address this component and address this component and bring it together so that we can have the best possible outcome for our patients. And I say be prepared, put our feet on the ground and be prepared and walk in the patient's rooms and walk in those settings, knowing that this is a whole area that we can address, this whole population, do our training, do what we need to do in order to address the patient's needs. So mental health, I know you've seen the definition before, but why is it so important to understand mental health? Mental health is because this impacts how we engage. This impacts our daily activities, our occupations. This impacts our relationships and how we cope, how we adjust to change, even in less than optimal situations. This is the groundwork for how we think. This is the groundwork for how we communicate, how we learn, our executive functioning, how we manage our emotions and how we deal with relationships, and then our resiliency, how do we bounce back? So it's so important to understand that on that continuum, you have the mental health and then you have the mental illness on the other end. But it's so important to understand this factor because so much of our physical health is impacted by how we deal with our mental health. So let's look at some statistics. So about 25% or 20%, 1 in 5 adults live with a mental illness in the United States, and 1 in 25 experience a serious mental illness that greatly impacts their daily function. So if you look at these numbers, we function in so many different practice settings that you are going to encounter at some point someone who has either dealt with a mental illness in the past, or they're currently dealing with one, or maybe they have a family member that may have dealt with or dealing with a current mental illness. When you have over half of the adults with a mental health condition that have never sought out treatment, that's where we play a huge role, because we can begin to address those issues when in our practice settings for those patients that have not been able to who have fallen through the cracks and not able to reach out to into a behavioral health or psychiatric setting. So we're in a unique position, and oftentimes patients may not, I think we've heard this before, patients may not reach out for help because of the stigma attached to mental health. They may not be able to seek out treatment because of resources. They may feel ashamed. They may just not be knowledgeable about it. And then also there tends to be a lack of providers when it comes to addressing mental health needs. So OTs, again, we play a huge role. We can get in there and help bridge that gap and begin to address these challenges. People with mental illness tend to die approximately 25 years sooner. So that's crucial. That's so important that we begin to address this issue as far as longevity. Those with chronic physical conditions have increased rates of mental illness. So if you think about why, maybe this is a new diagnosis for this person, maybe they are depressed now, they feel like they've lost control. So you have an increased rate of mental illness within that particular population. You think about someone who, for example, is dealing with chronic pain or lack of sleep. Mental illness can kind of creep in there. And when you think about mental illness, I want you to think beyond just what we consider to be our major, heavy hitters. It could be, such as schizophrenia or bipolar or, major depressive disorders. Mental illness can hit any of us at any time. It could be because you've had a sudden medical challenge. Maybe you had a financial disaster. Maybe you had the loss of a loved one. We've been experiencing all these natural disasters, and then with the pandemic. So it's not the people that have mental illnesses, they look just like you and I, and they have everyday lives and challenges just like you and I. And sometimes it can become difficult for them to manage and be able to cope. So one of the leading causes of death in the US in 2020 was death by suicide. And then over 11 million adults have considered or thought about suicide at one point. That's a lot of people. And so we need to understand that with these numbers, if you look at over 17 million adults who have had at least one depressive episode, and we're talking about seasonal depression, it could be psychotic depression, it could be loss of depression from grief, it could be anything in that space. That's a lot of people. And I think we can really empower our patients and empower ourselves by really addressing these particular issues. So what can we do as therapists? What can we do as occupational therapists? Number one, I highly encourage you to just do a thorough background research. Look and see, what kind of history does this patient have? Do they have a history of bipolar? Do they have a history of suicide attempts? Do they have a history of anxiety? Do they have a family member that may have had these same challenges? And the reason why I say that is because if you have a patient, let's say, for example, that's not able to walk, they're not able to do their basic self-care tasks. It could be because they have an underlying anxiety condition. It could be because of nervousness. Not nervousness, but depression. It could be because, they've had a history of mental illness or a family member that may have. All of that impacts patient functional outcomes. So it's important that we do thorough chart reviews, talk to family members, do what we can just to create an entire picture on how to focus and deal with that particular patient. Make sure that you actively listen. I can't stress this enough. If I don't listen to what you have to say, and that means listening without interruption, listening without minimizing, listening without dismissing, I can't see you where you are. And in order for me to help you, I have to meet you and understand where you are. Every patient is different. And so as OTs, we're so flexible and whole person oriented that we need to be able to hear. I need to be able to hear you in order to establish those plans and interventions to meet your needs. Make sure that you use opportunities to provide choices within safe boundaries. If you know that the patient has been in their room, in the hospital room for a while, they probably feel out of control. They probably feel locked in. They probably feel like they don't have any power. They feel limited. So use that, be creative and use those opportunities to really incorporate some of these mental health components into your treatment session, of course, within the boundaries of safety. Always ask about sensory preferences. We're all different in how we integrate our environment and how we process our environment. Some people, some things that may calm me down may actually alert someone else. Some things that might alert me may calm someone else down. I often think about the example when I worked on a psychiatric unit. We had an ice machine that used to hum and make noise all the time. Some of the patients that came in, that was actually calming to them. That was actually white noise for them. But for me, I found it to be irritating. And so when we go into, we approach our patients, we need to really study their environment and make sure that we understand that there may be something in that environment that's triggering that patient. There may be something that we can incorporate that may calm that patient. But the only way I can know that is to be able to sit down and have a discussion with that patient and find out what their preferences are. Make sure that you set expectations. I can't stress this enough. Even those of us who are maybe on the outside, we want to know what to expect. And so that we can prepare. This helps reduce anxiety. So when you walk in, let the patient know, hey, I'm here, I'm going to be here for this amount of time. These are the questions that I want to ask you. Also ask for permission. Ask for permission to enter into their space. That's how you empower the patient. And let the patient know that, hey, I have these questions to ask you, but it's okay if you don't want to answer them. And that will help with communication and help set expectations and help reduce any feelings of anxiety or nervousness. Ask about what their routines are, what their interest levels are. Again, understanding, I wrote interest twice, so that means you doubly need to ask that. Find out what they like, what they don't like, and see if you're able to incorporate that into your treatment session. Inquire about their diet and their sleep. All of these are parts of our behaviors. Those are the behaviors that impact how we function. As I did my research on sleep, the inadequate sleep can greatly impact your physical health. It can cause heart disease. It can increase your chances of engaging in substance abuse. It can impact your diet. So sleep is critical. It can impact you cognitively. So I need to understand, how much are you sleeping? How does this impact your daily life? And then your diet. We're learning that, what you intake, water, the types of food, all of that impacts your mental health. And so we don't necessarily have to just focus on that psych setting. We're boots on the ground. We're out there in different areas. So we're able to address these issues. What can we do? Use deep breathing exercises, 20 to 30 seconds of visualization. Make sure that you understand the patient's history of trauma. We always want to make sure we create a safe space. Help them identify coping skills. Use sensory input strategies like we talked about earlier. DBT, CBT, these are strategies that you could use to help ground patients, to help reframe their thinking. So we are definitely skilled to empower our patients. Benefits for functional outcomes. If we focus on these things, the patients are going to be more compliant. They're going to be more communicative. They're going to have less complaints. They're going to see us. As more skilled, and it's going to improve their overall satisfaction. If you think about triple aim, we're educating, we're focusing on cost-effective approaches, and then we're also making sure that patient has a great experience. And this helps decrease anxiety as well. Now, my last frame I put to be continued. And my reason for doing that is because patients change, people change, our situations change. And so as OTs and as therapists, we need to be willing to change as well. We need to be able to learn and adjust our evidence-based approaches in order to better serve and treat our patients. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoskins. Please, everyone, round of applause. Thank you so much. A question, and while people are formulating their questions, please, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. One thing that I want to ask you is, how do you communicate that interprofessionally? And by that, I mean all the resources that you provided. Because, for instance, in my current setting, we co-treat and collaborate so much with our other disciplines. And sometimes it's difficult for other disciplines to see the value that OT brings, because for some individuals, they may think OT is fine motor. They may think Absolutely. OT is just putting on socks. They may think OT is just brushing teeth. And they don't realize that in all of our curriculums, we have an intense psychology course, and all of our prerequisites to get into OT school, we have to take general psychology, abnormal psychology, all these psychology courses. And we have so much to bring, but sometimes I feel as though providers, they quench all of those resources and values that they can bring to the patient. So if you wouldn't mind speaking, how have you communicated intercollaboratively, or excuse me, interprofessionally with other disciplines on what you have to bring and why it's of value to the patient?
That's a very, very good question. And I think it starts with us. Understanding what we are, what our role is, and that we can operate in that space. There are many of us as colleagues that don't understand that we can address these components. And so how can I train another therapist who's in another discipline that this is what we're able to do if I don't understand that we're able to do it as well? So one of the things that I did in my last setting, doing in-services, even small in-services, large in-services on mental health challenges, what OTs does, the broad scope of what OT does. This education is so critical. And I think that's where we start, right at that ground level. If you look at our opportunities to work in academia, or anytime we have opportunities to work with students, teaching them that we're not limited with just that medical model, that physical component, that we're a broad and adaptive profession, and we can address all these wide areas. But I think it starts with us and taking every opportunity we can to educate, to do in-service trainings, and then incorporating those components into our assessments. We're not doing that. And we need to do more of that. We need to, put leisure, put, emotions, put history, all of that into that component so that it'll prompt you to address these areas. You talked about assessments earlier. It's okay to do like the PHQ-9. It's okay to do the ISI. The ISI is the Insomnia Severity Index. All of those are okay to incorporate into our assessment. And I think when people begin to see all of that, they understand that this is something that OT can do.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. We do have another question. It reads as, do you find that sensory integration differences are commonly present in those with a mental health diagnosis? And if so, do you think it should be normal protocol to utilize tools like the sensory processing measure or sensory profile in all mental health assessments?
That's a very good question. And yes, I do. I do think that people who are challenged with mental illnesses tend to struggle a bit more with sensory processing. On our unit, the unit where I used to work, we had a sensory room. And I did the training for that room and teaching the staff how to utilize that room as a therapy tool. So absolutely, I did the sensory profile many times with the patients so that you can find out what their preferences are. So when you're doing your assessment, you kind of talk to them and gauge how they process their environment. That'll give you a cue as to if you need to do the sensory profile or not. And then yes, absolutely, that sensory profile should be incorporated into your treatment session.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Such an understatement, Dr. Hoskins. Again, thank you for your past work. Thank you for your current work. And thank you for your future work in motivating us all.
Well, thank you for having me.
Excellent. Excellent. Everyone, please, round of applause. Ms. Judith Joseph, Executive Director of the Texas Occupational Therapy Association. Ms. Judith Joseph has been the Executive Director of the Texas Occupational Therapy Association since 2017. She worked in outpatient neuro rehab until June 2020. She has been an ADED certified driver rehabilitation specialist since 2013 and developed the clinical driving evaluation program at Houston Methodist Hospital in Houston, Texas. Judy obtained a BS in OT from Western Michigan University and a post-professional MA from Texas Women's University. She has been an OT for more years than she cares to admit, but if you need to count, 37 years has passed. Her personal philosophy is you should have at least one good laugh a day, even if it's at yourself. Miss Joseph, thank you so much for being here with us. Everyone, please, round of applause and all types of emojis that represent celebration. Miss Joseph, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all. It's such an honor to be here. And thank you for asking me to present. This is really quite an honor. And to have to follow all these amazing people and to be at the end. At first, when I first thought, oh, advocacy at the end, I'm not sure where exactly it fits in, but this seems to be just a perfect segue. So since I am the last speaker, maybe you might want to stand up and breathe and shake and move. Since we've been sitting for a while, I actually got up for a minute and rode my stationary bike. So again, thank you so much for asking me. And just because it is Black History Month, I wanted to just share a couple of little things. I was actually born in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is the burial place of Sojourner Truth, and which was a major station on the Underground Railroad. And so, as we're talking about mental health, one of the things that Battle Creek is known for, of course, is Kellogg's. And if anyone knows the Kellogg's Foundation or the history of that, they had a sanitarium and they did all sorts of, at the time they thought, I guess, were innovative, but they were quite interesting things that they did for people who had mental health challenges back in the day. A lot of water, just really strange things. So if you ever see this movie called The Road to Wellville, it's a quite interesting movie. And so, and just saying all that, I'm just going to go straight into my presentation. And I'm just advocating for OT and mental health. And we already know who I am. Advocacy is just very simple. We all know what it is. And as occupational therapy practitioners and leaders in this profession, we're advocating all the time, whether it is for our patients to have more therapy. Your documentation would, help dictate whether or not that person is going to get 3 days a week versus 2 days a week or no therapy whatsoever. If you're trying to get equipment, you're advocating for your patient because your documentation has to support that need. So advocacy is just the simple act of speaking on the behalf of or in support of another person, place, or thing. And the thing that I really, I've enjoyed all of the speakers. And Dr. Salvant, I'm such a history nerd. I loved history growing up. In fact, if I wasn't an OT professional, I was going to go to school and be a history teacher because I really was always intrigued by history, more so our history. And so as I go forward, just some of my simple objectives are how to identify ways of being involved locally. And by locally, I mean, of course, state associations, because that's my role, that's my jelly, but also in the community. What's going on in your community? Are there new facilities? Are there new training places? Are there new hospitals popping up? And then providing just a general overview, which most of us know, but there are students here, as I always am concerned about that. We don't recognize how legislation impacts occupational therapy practice. And then just demonstrating the importance of advocacy and leadership through membership in state associations and in AOTA. And I just cannot emphasize to you how important that is, because not that's because that's my job, but I believe that before I had this role. And then to identify opportunities for involvement. And I think about, everything that everyone has been saying, and we talked about the history and OT being rooted and grounded. And so when you look at advocacy and we talk about where do we start, you always have to start, because I'm a history nerd, you have to start by looking back sometimes, because if you don't look back, you need to know where you came from in order to see where you're going to be, right? So as several of the speakers have mentioned, is that, OT started here in mental health. And then Dr. Salvat was talking about in the beginning, what happened? How are we now in a place and space that we find ourselves having to advocate for occupational therapy's role in mental health? How has it we found ourselves having to defend that we belong in these places and spaces? How did we get here? So I've been practicing long enough, which, you hate when older people say, it's sort of like I walked to school and we had to, snow was up to my neck and so on. But look at you kids now, y'all fly to school in a helicopter. But, we look back and probably around in the 90s, late 90s and the early 2000s, and please you all correct me, but that's around the time where there were a lot of these mental health facilities started closing. A lot of the state hospitals began to close, and a lot of these institutions began to close. And when I was in school at Western Michigan, we had to do a medical model and a psychiatric model for our field work. But now, if all of those places and spaces that we used to work, they began to close, that meant less OT professionals were working in mental health because there were less facilities to work in. And then there were less fieldwork placements. And, for those of you who work in academia, there had to be some sort of shifting of where we're going to put these students. We don't have these psychiatric or these mental health fieldwork placements for people to go. So when these community-based mental health facilities started coming back around, we weren't there, right? So just because we weren't there, it didn't mean that need for our distinctive value that we offer in mental health, it doesn't mean that need wasn't still there, that the need to get people engaged in healthy occupations, but they started using other non-skilled, people with high school diplomas to provide some of this training. And so now we're coming back and we're like, we should be in these places and spaces, but that's how we sort of got there, right? And now we are finding ourselves, because people don't know what we do in a lot of these different areas. So when I say, where do we start? And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say review the core curriculum. And Dr. Dudley was saying that, there were some prerequisites that we had to take. But when I had to go and advocate on behalf of occupational therapy practitioners in Texas, and I'll tell you a little bit about this as we go through, and I'm going to be very mindful of my time. I should have started my clock. But one of the problems was, when we ran up against some problems, was the core curriculum and some of the programs had one mental health class. And even though the prerequisites, they were there, they weren't looking at that. They looked at the core curriculum. And then some of the folks in academia would say, well, we have mental health is weaved into the syllabus, weaved into the curriculum, but people outside of the OT profession looking in at the curriculum didn't see that. And so they were thinking, we are graduating from OT schools, not really being prepared to work in these mental health spaces because we've had one class. That was some of the conversations that I had, and I'll tell you how that happened. And then I would also say, meeting with other groups and associations. And there were some references that several presenters used from NAMI, from SAMHSA, and different other agencies. So you might have to find yourself talking to the licensed and marriage family counselors, the social workers, and the physician assistants and the medical association, because these might be other groups that would oppose or thinking that what we're doing is an infringement of scope of practice, right? So what do you do and how do you start? And I'm going to take a deep breath. So get information from the practitioners who are doing the work. And so when I talk to folks like Dr. Hoskins, and one of the things that we did as part of our advocacy effort, I was we need to talk to the OT practitioners that are actually right now working in these mental health spaces. And what are you doing? And that was real important, because as we were trying to find out from those professionals, what I wanted to know, as I have to go and talk to Health and Human Services or different legislative bodies or other organizations, what billing codes were you using? And, you know, what we found out is they were some of the basic billing codes. There was nothing different there. And again, what assessment tools are you using? And, you know, OTs, that's the thing. We have so many different assessment tools. And are we in the academic world? What are the students? What assessment tools for mental health are we using more on a consistent basis? And like Dr. Hoskins and everyone else was saying, there are so many different assessment tools, but what assessment tools are you using? And I almost didn't find a common assessment tool once I asked all of these various practitioners. And unfortunately, some people were like, oh, we just sort of do an interview, and you know, that's not enough. And again, as you all were even asking questions, what interventions are you providing? And the reason why, as an advocate for OT practice and mental health, when our lobbyists are sometimes going in and out of different offices, different state representatives, or even when AOTA personnel lobbyists are going to talk to people on the federal level, and it's easy, as our lobbyist said, it's easy for them to articulate what we do in the physical space, you know, and in physical rehab. But it wasn't as easy for them to articulate and explain what OTs did in mental health. So sometimes, even when I was asking the practitioners, what do you do? People would say, oh, we work with people who have suicidal ideations. Oh, we work with people who have bipolar disorders. Oh, we work with schizophrenia disorder. But what do you do? Tell me, what are you doing? Because as I worked in adult neuro, I could tell you what kinds of activities or interventions I used for the stroke patient to get them, you know, to engage in activities or to get them more independent. And so those are the things that the people who are advocating for us, they need to be able to clearly articulate and say, this is what OT does in this setting. And we actually, Dr. Hoskins and I went and met with an organization in Texas called the Jewish Family Services. Jewish Family Services is very well organized, very well funded through the community, and they have just a plethora, just a lot of different offerings for mental health issues. They have various groups and things like that. And so when we were talking with them, they wanted to know, you know, well, what's different with OT? How can you tell us that this is not a duplication of services because it sounds like this or it sounds like that? And so we need to be able to explain to them what is the distinctive value of OT. And you have to make sure that your lobbyist or whoever is going to advocate for you can say that. And so we and a lot of times, sometimes we might be our own worst enemy. We have to be able to say it as well. And what are some of the barriers that exist that limit OT services? And those were the kinds of things that I wanted to know from the practitioners out there. You know, what's your barriers? Are you having any trouble getting referrals, or what's limiting you? And the biggest thing is people just not knowing what OT is again. And I think I wanted to, you know, again, when we say, you know, where do we start? Again, that preparation. And one of the things that I've noticed when I go around to lecture at various schools, now that we're getting back into the physical places, it's nice to not have to always go and speak to academic programs and, you know, virtually. But, you know, when I go into an academic setting and I look around at the students who are looking or listening or participating, and they're dressed in scrubs. And it always makes me a little bit concerned, because are we training people to work in the medical model? Or, I mean, why are we having to wear scrubs all the time in a classroom setting? And it almost gives you that mindset of a medical model. And I see this more frequently when I go speak to OTA programs. They're, in scrubs. And you might wear scrubs in a medical setting if your psychiatric unit is in a medical setting, but in a community setting, you're more than likely not. And I'm always concerned, and I wonder how are some of us being prepared to go work into these mental health settings, or is it more, are we thinking more the medical model? Because when students come out, I don't have a whole lot of people saying, oh, I'm going to go work in a mental health facility. Most people are saying, I'm going to work in peds, I'm going to work here, I'm going to work there. But very few say, I'm going to work in a mental health setting, or that's their goal. And so the role of your state associations, and I will just, I will shame anyone who's not a member of their state associations, because there's no one else that's going to go to bat for you and say, look at the mission or the role of your state association. I mean, ours is simple. We're here for the benefit of professionals and students of occupational therapy. So we're going to advocate on behalf of you. There's not another organization that's going to stand up and say, oh, I really want occupational therapy, and this is why. And, no one else is really doing that. And I've heard practitioners say that do home health. I'm a member of the Home Health Association of, beings and chutes and ladders. I don't know, but it's not occupational therapy, right? So then I ask you to go and look at your licensing board. And I ask students this all the time. And a lot of people think in our profession that the licensing boards are there to protect occupational therapy practice, but they're not. The roles of our licensing boards are to protect the consumer. We have a license because that says we've been trained and we can do this, and nobody else can say I'm an occupational therapist or an occupational therapy assistant, because it's not legal to do that. You're misrepresenting yourself, and it could be damaging to the consumer. It's not because they love OT so much that they're going to protect OT. It's because they want to protect this consumer. And, this is Texas. This is just a snippet of what it says in our licensing board. That's their role. And please feel free to, one of the things that I would ask for all of you to do, if you've never done this, to look at your Practice Act. Most people never look at their Practice Act. So one of the things that I found out is when I looked at our Practice Act, because when you go to advocate and you go to say occupational therapy needs to be included in this or that, and one of the things that AOTA and Megan and Chuck and Christian Nevels, they all will tell you that every state is different when it comes to this mental health thing. And so we figured in Texas, we don't really need to be considered a non-physician qualified mental health provider, practitioner. We looked at our Practice Act and I said, hey, let's stop. Look at this. This says right here what we do. And so it's not a scope of practice issue. This has been in place since 1999. So it says the occupational therapist evaluates or treats a person whose ability to perform the task of living is threatened or impaired by developmental deficits, the aging process, environmental deprivation, sensory impairment, physical injury or illness, or psychological or social dysfunction, right? It's right there. So recently we had our legislative day, we call it Day at the Capitol. And one of a student and a practitioner went in to talk to one of the senators, state senators, and they started mentioning that's what we were pushing for, is this mental health. and oh, that's a scope of practice issue. Nope, this is what our practice act says. This is nothing new. We're not asking for anything new. And it also says here in 2A, we evaluate, prevent, or correct physical or emotional dysfunction. And it just goes on. I just ask you to just go back and look at your practice act, because it's not something that the average OT practitioner will do, probably, unless you get in trouble for something. But this is a weird thing in Texas. And again, when you talk about how legislation affects practice, some, either a senator, this was either a House bill or a Senate bill, but they put this clause in here in C: the practice of occupational therapy does not include diagnosis or psychological services of the type typically performed by a licensed psychologist. So you got to know that that was written into that language because some other profession felt threatened by occupational therapy. So they wanted to make sure that there was this distinction. And so this language still exists in our Practice Act. But again, it does say what we can do. So that's really important. So you hear that phrase all the time, oh, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. I'm going to tell you, advocating for OT and mental health, it's not a marathon, it's an Ironman triathlon. And I mean out in the desert, because it's been a long haul, it's a long journey, and you can't get tired, you can't give up. And I think somebody in one of these presentations was talking about, we belong here, you can't give up. And I'm just using our efforts as an example. I mean, we started this battle in 2013. It's 2023. The weird thing about Texas is our legislative session meets every other year. Your state might meet every year. So we meet only every other year, and they only meet for 140 days, unless it was like a craziness, like or it was just the most unusual. And I apologize for saying craziness. It was the most unusual legislative session in 2021. So here we are back in 23 trying to go back and get some things done. But that's the challenge. So we started advocating for this in 2013. And I want to just talk out. Am I okay with time, you guys? I want to talk about this. Back in 2015, there was a state representative, his name was Garnet Coleman, and he sponsored a bill that would designate OT therapy practitioners as non-physician mental health professionals. It went nowhere. I mean, it died and people attacked it. I don't even think it got out of the House, let alone did it get a hearing in the Senate. So that bill was attacked by the social workers, licensed family practitioners, marriage. And their fear was, once we went to go meet with them, again, they didn't think that we were getting enough education. But in Texas, as an occupational therapy practitioner, there's nothing that precludes you from graduating and starting your own business. And so they thought, well, these OT practitioners are going to take over, right? They're going to graduate and they're going to start opening their own behavioral health or mental health clinics. And this is a scope of practice issue, and they're not prepared. So these are just, I'm not going to read those to you, but these are just, I just want you to see that this is, such a long haul. So the next session after that one, we really focused on educating stakeholders as to what occupational therapy did, who we were, and what we did in this practice setting. And so, obviously we're not defined in the Texas Code as, as a behavioral health provider. So there's some things that we're starting to look at that we are able to, there's a lot of key or a lot of power in the language. And you'll hear this from anybody who works in advocacy. For your name to be included in certain language or for it to be excluded can be problematic, and it can be a barrier, just not having your name in there. And one of the things that I noticed last year, we have Medicaid, and we get funding through Medicaid, which all of us do. Each state Medicaid is run differently. It's a federal fund. However, it's up to the states on how those funds are utilized, right? And so in the language in our Medicaid definition of how OT gets reimbursed, it continues to talk about an acute medical illness. And so we're asking for that language to be changed, for it to be to have mental illness or behavioral illnesses or conditions to be included in that matches what our Practice Act says. So once we identify that this is not a scope of issue, we're not asking for anything new, we're asking for this language to match what our Practice Act says we can do. And so now there's some considerations being done. So it's a lot of work. Again, writing to these legislative or these HHSC, which is the Health and Human Services Commission, and they manage Texas Medicaid. The other thing that's interesting is there may be another agency, like for instance, in Texas, there's this whole behavioral health division of the Health and Human Services, and most of their funding comes through grants. And so, when we look at their behavioral health case management book, occupational therapy services was not included in it anywhere at all. And so that was a huge problem. So now when we went to the Senate hearing, there was all of this discussion. And I think someone else mentioned, I think it was Dr. Savant, that, COVID was a blessing and a curse. But one of the things is that all of these mental health issues have come out. And I shared with Dr. Kitchens earlier, or maybe it was last night, that could she share with this article, and it just talks about this huge problem of the lack of mental health providers, and there's this huge shortage. So these are just some of the things that we're doing, meeting with community agencies that provide mental health services. There's a new hospital being built, just for mental health. And we're trying to make sure that there's some occupational therapy jobs. And so I've been asking people, can you share your job descriptions with us so that we can go to these other new agencies? Because someone asked me, well, what does an OT job description look like in mental health? And so asking people to share those with us so that we can share them with these other agencies is really helpful. And this is pretty simple. What role does politics play? And as I've been saying, the senators on the state level, state senators, state representatives, these people write the bills. And same as the federal, Congress people and senators, once these bills get written, they have to go to an agency for those rules and regulations. So that's, and I'm talking this way because I know there's a lot of students here, but that's why your professors are, harping so on your diagnosis, on your documentation, because if your documentation doesn't support what you do, you're not going to get reimbursed. If you can't get reimbursed for what you do, there's not going to be a job there. Why have you there, as an occupational therapy practitioner, and I can't get reimbursed for the services that you're providing? So sometimes it sounds confusing, but it shouldn't be. Advocacy and leadership all go hand in hand. And so I just have this little slide that, AOTA and TOTA or any of the state associations are there to advocate for the protection and practice of OT. You have to be a member. It's completely irresponsible for us not to be members, because it's sort of like your job insurance. You've invested all of this time and energy and money in your education to get out, and you want there to be a job for you. If we can't get reimbursed for our services, or if they can't create these positions for us, then there are going to be fewer and fewer employment opportunities for these new grads. And I mean, their programs, I know there was somebody here from UTMB, and Dr. Kitchens is University of Texas Medical Branch, Galveston. You guys have really huge cohorts of like almost 60. So that's a big number. Here's a problem. I'm just highlighting ours, but this is not new. This is every state association, and AOTA has the same problem. You have X number of licensed practitioners. In Texas, there are over 18,000. And then we have 1,500 or so members. And then out of those, this 800 are students. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because there's safety in numbers, right? We've always heard that there's safety in numbers. Don't walk to school alone. Even there's safety in numbers. So when I go, or AOTA people go, or any of us go to advocate on behalf of occupational therapy, they're like, well, how many members do you have? Everybody wants, oh, occupational therapy is so wonderful, and I love my profession. How can you love your profession if there are 18,000 of us, and then there's only 1,500, 800 or so that feel like it's important enough that I need to be a member of an association that advocates for me, that's going to talk to these senators and legislators and stakeholders and various agencies? You can't do that by yourself. You probably can, but it's going to be more impactful as a larger group. And that's why membership is so important. And it's the important part of advocacy. And I had one senator, when I was in their office, he sort of nudged me with his elbow, strange. And he goes, so how many members do you really have? Because guess what? He was a physician, and the Physicians Association is huge. They were strong enough, in fact, that when the Texas Licensing Board wanted to adopt the definition of occupational therapy that AOTA has, there was some language in there that they decided was a scope of practice issue. And so they could not change the definition. One of them was, we do medication management. And there was a couple of other things that I can't right off the top of my head think of. But their association was so big and so strong, and they gave such a threat that our licensing board did not move forward with adopting AOTA's definition of OT, right? That says a lot. So I really want to encourage you all to be involved at your state level, because that's going to help you right where you are. But everything is important. And AOTA has a legislative action center. And I just, ask that you look at that on a regular basis. I've heard one occupational therapy academic person, and they were like, oh, AOTA, I don't know, think they do anything. And I said, how can you say that? There's so much work that gets done from, the advocacy efforts of AOTA, and this was a good success, right? The Mental Health Parity Act, this was a good success. And so I probably should have updated this, but I just thought this was important because this was a huge effort on AOTA's part. And for us to not be supportive of that, not recognize how much work gets done from a state level and from a federal level from AOTA, we have got to do better, because that's where it starts, right? That's where making sure OT is visible and that we're employed, that our services are reimbursed. And so these are just some other, I just wanted to highlight some more of the AOTA lobbying efforts. And I'll end here. This is my OT jacket that I had with a little "I voted" sticker on it. And my husband's favorite saying, lead, follow, or get out of the way, means stay involved. Are you doing your part, right? That's all I got.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. If you can go ahead, the emojis, go ahead, represent those emojis with celebration. If you want to turn on your cameras and clap and all those gesticulations. That's perfectly fine. Thank you so much. If I could surmise that into maybe one or two words, I would say assertiveness. You know, being an OT means that you need to, some of all the professions, is you need to be assertive to others about what we do, as well as being assertive to others within the profession. And, you know, I definitely got my toes stepped on when you mentioned a membership. I'm a member of our state association, but it definitely took peers to say, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what's going on? And so even though I'm a member, you definitely, you know, broke a toe. And so thank you for that. And so we do have some questions. We're going to jump right in. One of our questions is regarding reimbursement. And I saw the chat, and I saw the topic and the word reimbursement coming up on and on. So this question is reimbursement for mental health a barrier? If so, what can we do about that?
Well, reimbursement, again, it's all about the language. Reimbursement can't be a barrier. Like for instance, in Texas with Medicaid, just that language continues to say an acute medical condition. We need that language to make sure that it's inclusive of mental health problems. And so for the most part, the billing codes are there. The biggest problem that was a barrier was salaries. So in some of the community-based mental health facilities, you know, you guys aren't going to graduate from OT school with your doctorate degree and work for $15 to $17 an hour. You would, you know, rather pick poop with the chickens, as my mom would say. So that is a big barrier more than anything sometimes were some of the salaries in the community settings. But the reimbursement, I wouldn't say that was the biggest issue.
Mm-hmm. Good to know. And I know a representative from NYSOTA had mentioned that the reimbursement levels, as you mentioned, were so low.
Well, yeah.
Problematic, yeah.
That reimbursement, there are a lot of practitioners, whether you work in mental health or pediatrics or every setting. The biggest complaint is, you know, the cost of doing business continues to rise. However, the cost of, you know, Medicare reimbursement hasn't gone up. You know, they're not paying more money. And then, of course, in private insurance, as long as Medicare gets away with that, they sort of follow that, then they're going to sort of reduce their payments as well. So that's also part of advocacy is, you know, restoration of rates, of reimbursement rates, and actually improving them. So across the board, whatever area of practice, those reimbursement rates are prohibitive in some places, especially in private practice.
Yes, most definitely. Our next question is, some registered and licensed practitioners feel that the associations at times fail to hear their voices and say why, and say why. How do we counter this mindset for our profession, where we have a negative, in essence, if I may, the belief that our association fails to hear our perceptions, fails to truly care about what matters to us, and as well as how to advance a profession? How do we counteract this mindset that many seasoned as well as new providers encounter?
I think the biggest thing is, you know, we just had a board retreat, and it is the why. Why are you a member? And what I've heard from some state associations, when I send out an email or informational email, e-letter, or our newsletter, it goes out to members and non-members. And I think, you know, I've even heard some state association leaders say, if that person is not a member, they don't even really talk to them on the phone too much. I try to talk to everybody, and, you know, whether you're a member or not, because there has to be something that I'm hoping that either I do or say might resonate with you so that you would become a member. But I think the key is, a lot of us, I always say we have an identity crisis, and people think that it's sort of a social event. But just doing these surveys, what we've really looked at is trying to find out what people want. And people want mentorship, they want networking. You know, it used to be the state associations had more power because of an AOTA. We could provide these continuing education things. But now, you know, you can do otpt.com or whatever for $99 a year and get continuing ed. So that's not, we can't just lay our hats on that. We really have to get the message out. And I think advocacy really is the most important part of what state associations do. That, you know, and trying to bring people together, trying to make sure, you know, what do you want from us, and always asking. So I think if you feel like your state association is not listening, call them directly, you know, email the executive director. You know, I talk to people all the time, but I try to be a little more accessible to people than maybe some other people are. And I tease our licensing board because I say, you know, I think I've like helped so many people renew their license, because some people still don't know the difference between the licensing board and the state association. So, but, you know, just being able to listen and provide what some of those things are that people want, I think is really important.
Excellent. Ms. Joseph, thank you so much. Again, I want to echo what I previously said. Thank you for what you've done for us in the past. Thank you for what you're currently doing for us. And thank you for all that you're going to do for us in the future. Thank you for all of our speakers who have come here to share and encourage us. If we can go ahead, a round of applause for all of our speakers. And then now I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Akia, as well as Donald, as they go ahead and do our wrapping, closing remarks, and evaluations. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to stay on for our announcements and our evaluation links.
Wow, wow, wow is all that I can say. If I can use, and I'm not much of a baseball, not very knowledgeable in baseball, but I would say that we started off with Dr. Savant hitting it out of the park, and each one of our speakers rounded those bases, and Miss Judy Joseph brought it on home. This was amazing. I want to just summarize a few key points that we've been able to talk about. I guess before I do that, I probably should introduce myself. I'm Dr. Akia Kitchens. I am the president-elect for the National Black OT Caucus and have the privilege of being able to provide some of the acknowledgements and announcements as we prepare to wrap up what has been such a rich, rich conference. If I can have a few moments just to kind of summarize some of the key pieces that resonated with me that I hope that we'll be able to take home with you, for you. Dr. Savant really opened up in sharing some of the historical pieces of what has led to some of these the issues that we're facing, not just as individuals, but as a society and community, when we think about mental health and mental illness, particularly within the African American community. So that was powerful, as some of the other attendees have stated. Some pieces you might not have even known, but how everything is tied in together. And so the importance of being able to engage in that self-care for us as individuals, and also how do we teach that to our clients. Some of the other pieces that were important, being able to the student facilitated discussion. So I'm going to take a moment and thank our student facilitators. So if they are still on, I'm just going to recognize them. We have Morgan McKnight, who is a student at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Wonderful job. We have Miss Moni Akiwowo, who is also a student at University of Texas Medical Branch. They are my students, so I am so proud of you both. We have Mr. Tyron Jones, who is a student at Howard University. Thank you so much. And we have Miss Danae Arnold, which I think dropped off, but she is a student at Florida A&M University. So thank you so much for serving in this capacity and for the excellent job in facilitating that discussion. And there was so many things that came out of those discussions as I was bouncing through. Dr. Savant gave a really good summary of that. But some of the key pieces were in terms of saying yes to yourself. You know, being able to say yes to yourself, setting healthy boundaries, having such a rich discussion, knowing that you deserve to be in these spaces. You were chosen to be in these educational spaces, and we need you. in these spaces. We need you in the profession. So I hope that you all felt empowered with that. Then we had Dr. Faison, who came in and talked to us, amazing conversation about really able to talk about mental health and mental illness and being able to distinguish between the two so that we have more informed language that we can use when we are engaging with our clients and thinking about mental health overall in terms of OT practice. And also some practical tips about how to start those conversations and how to have those conversations in a way that's respectful. And then Dr. Hoskins came in and talked to us about the way that our mental health helps to influence our engagement with each other, and then gave us some really good practical tips in the practice area for doing in-services and making our colleagues aware of what we're doing and what the value we bring to the table as occupational therapy practitioners. And then Ms. Joseph rounded us out with talking about the importance of advocacy and where we can get involved and why it's so important for us to get involved as OT practitioners, and not just at the practitioner level, but also as students. So I just want to say, I hope that the key pieces that I took, that we are informed. I hope that you are feeling more informed, more empowered, and that you have found a way to be able to get engaged, because that was one of the key pieces that was a theme for all of the speakers that we had today and part of the discussion. And we can't do this work as powerfully without you, because as Ms. Joseph said, there's power in numbers. So I want to take a few moments. Mr. Donald, do you have any things that you would like to share in terms of takeaways or feedback?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kitchens. I just want to echo thank you to our students, to our MC, to our speakers for your vast knowledge and for your richness of your knowledge, being a subject matter expert in areas that you spoke about today. If you're not charged up, if you're not excited, if you're not fired up about what you heard today, shame on you, because we've been challenged to do differently, to do better, and we can. And we can insert ourselves to have a seat at the table and to do more than what we've done. I think it's incumbent upon us to involve ourselves in our local chapters, our state associations, and in AOTA to move the needle a little bit further. And we need to have more sessions in times like this to edify and build each other up, because in doing that, it allows us to have more confidence, more competence, and then be encouraged to go out and help others. So thank you all for being present today and for the richness that we've felt and heard today. Thank you.
We want to acknowledge a few people. So we do have a few sponsors today for our session. So the Greater Charlotte Healthcare Executives Group serves the Charlotte area and all other portions of the Western North Carolina, not designated under another chapter agreement. GCHEG has been active since 1985 and currently has a roster of over 650 members. This group acts as a local resource to promote the American College of Healthcare Executives and the importance of membership. They also offer, their officers are ACHE members that speak to the benefits of membership involvement at both local and national levels. This group has donated 2 $50 gift cards for attendees of our session. And these gift cards will be raffled off to those that complete the complete the conference survey at the end. So you have to stay tuned for that QR code and that link. So we want to thank this organization. They are inviting everyone who is interested to their student organization Spring Social that will be held on March 3rd from 6:30 to 8 p.m. local time. And the address is listed here for those who are in the North Carolina area. So thank you so much to the Greater Charlotte Healthcare Executives Group for their support for this event today. And then one of the other sponsors that we have is our very own Dougleen Jackson, Dr. Dougleen Jackson. And so she's working with WPS for over 75 years. WPS has been the leading independent publisher of educational and psychological assessments and related intervention resources in the areas of autism, speech and language, school and clinical psychology, and occupational therapy. WPS is honored to donate a sensory processing measures second edition online kit to an attendee of the NBOTC BROTHAS conference today. So we thank you, Dr. Jackson, and WPS for supporting our event today. That will also be raffled off to one of our attendees that completes the survey. And now I'm going to move into our announcements. We have just a few. For the students who are attending the National Black OT Caucus, our Francis Swift Scholarship Award is available for occupational therapy and occupational therapy assistant students. One of our most recent OT NBOTC student scholarship award winners is on today, Miss Moni Akiwowo, who was our student facilitator. She was a recipient last year. If you want more information about the scholarship, the application requirement, please contact Dr. Brendan Cook. Brendan, please raise your hand so everyone can see you. He is the scholarship chair, and his contact information, Brendan, icook23@gmail.com. And we want to go ahead, we want to acknowledge some of our new officers. So the National Black OT Caucus recently installed 3 new officers that we want to introduce you to today. I am the new president-elect, Dr. Rakia Kitchen. Dr. Brendan Cook is the new treasurer for our organization. Dr. Cook, are you on? Wave, applause. Okay, and Dr. Nardia Aldridge is serving as the Eastern Region Member at Large. So we have several Black OT Caucus chapters around the nation. And there's been a lot of interest in those that want to start chapters or form chapters in their respective areas. So if you have questions or you're a part of a chapter, I see a few chapter representatives here. I see New York here, I see Michigan here, South Florida. Please get in touch with Dr. Aldridge to make sure that we have your contact information so we can follow up with you. Now, with that being said, we do have a few open positions for National Black OT Caucus. Going off of what Ms. Judy Joseph said, get involved. There is a space for you. So we currently have open positions for vice president and secretary. We will be sharing more information about that. So if you are interested in wanting to find a place to serve, we will certainly welcome you within the National Black OT Caucus. There is enough work to go around for us to do to make an impact. So if you have questions about that, feel free to contact me or reach out to at the National Black OT Caucus for more information. We are meeting at AOTA. AOTA is taking place in April, and we have a space for the National Black OT Caucus, a meetup that will take place on Friday, April the 21st, 2023, from 7 to 9 p.m. in Kansas City, Missouri. At this time, we're still trying to work out some details as to whether or not we can offer a virtual option. But if you are on the ground in Kansas City, Missouri, we want to see you. We want to meet you. We want to connect with you. So please make sure that you save that date on your calendar. I've already asked all of the chapters affiliated with the National Black OT Caucus to contact Dr. Aldridge. And then the Brothers AOTA meetup, if you are a brother and you want to get connected, please contact them so they can keep you informed and engage you as well. We want to acknowledge Mr. Andre Johnson, who just recently received the Sandra Barker Dunbar Leadership Scholarship Award for the South Florida Black OT Caucus. Andre, are you there? Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, I am.
Welcome, congratulations. And
Thank you.
Wonderful announcement. The National Black OT Caucus has been in existence since 1974. Next year, 2024, we will celebrate 50 years of excellence, and we want to see all of you there. So we are planning some awesome things that are currently in development. If you have gifts, talents, and skills that you want to contribute to a part of this planning process and be a part, please reach out to me and let us know so that you can be a part of that process. If I am not missing anything, we have come to the conclusion of our session. I want to thank everyone for coming in. Oh, I do have one last thing. Each attendee will receive a certificate for attendance so that practitioners can use what has been covered today to submit for CEU credits if they so desire. These certificates will be released for those that complete the conference survey. So the QR code for the survey is here. I will leave this slide up for those to use that, to complete that. And I think we have a link that should be going in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Dudley, for doing that. And if I'm not missing anything else, I think we have come to the conclusion today. Hopefully you're feeling empowered and engaged. And as Dr. Salvant said, I look forward to frolicking after this and hope that you all find a reason to frolic too. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Thank you so much for attending.